The sky was thin and brittle at that altitude, a pale field of cold light stretching above the clouds. Through the canopy of a German fighter, a lone pilot watched the silhouettes below him climb with painful slowness. Their wings looked too small, their fuselages too thick, their movements too heavy for the brutal arena they were entering. From his oxygen mask came the faint trace of laughter, a quiet disbelief that anything shaped like that could survive the world waiting above France. But war has a way of rewriting its own rules. What those pilots saw that morning were not mere machines struggling toward the fight. They were looking at the first steps of a weapon built on a different vision of air power, a machine that would turn ridicule into fear and tilt the balance of the skies. The gap between what the eye could see and what history would remember was wide enough to swallow an Air Force whole. And somewhere in that thin, icy air hung the question that would define the months ahead. What happens when a fighter that should not have worked becomes the one no enemy can escape? The story truly begins long before those first encounters above France. In the summer of 1940, while Europe burned under the rapid advance of German air power, American planners studied the wreckage of countries that had fallen and understood a truth that was as cold as the steel they would soon forge. If the next war was to be won, it would be won at altitude. German fighters had carved through the skies with deadly precision, and the United States needed something that could reach higher, hit harder, and endure the kind of punishment that broke lesser machines apart. When engineers at Republic Aviation received the Army's urgent specifications, they faced a dilemma that bordered on the impossible. Traditional fighter design favored light frames, nimble wings, and quick movements. But the threat now rising above Europe demanded a fighter built around a different philosophy. Alexander Kartveli, the Georgian-born designer entrusted with the task, made a choice that startled even his own team. He would not build a sleeker Spitfire or a cleaner Messerschmitt. He would build something larger, stronger, and far more powerful than anything in American service. The prototype that emerged, the XP-47B, did not slip into the air so much as force its way upward. Its massive turbocharged engine filled the fuselage like a beating heart of metal and fire. Its wings carried the weight of 8 heavy machine guns. Its silhouette looked awkward, its proportions alarming. Test pilots approached it with the same uneasy respect that soldiers give to unfamiliar artillery. And yet, when the throttle opened, the aircraft climbed as though it had found a secret path through the sky. But progress came at a terrible cost. Between late 1942 and early 1943, training squadrons struggled to tame the machine. The aircraft ground looped without warning, torque rolled if handled carelessly, and dove so fiercely that pilots occasionally felt the controls freeze beneath their hands. The statistics were grim. Dozens of aircraft lost, too many young airmen killed before they ever saw an enemy. The Thunderbolt seemed less like a promise and more like a threat that turned inward. Even so, the design refused to be judged by first impressions. Those who survived the early months learned that beneath its size lay an engine that refused to quit and a frame that could drink punishment without falling apart. When combat finally came to the heavy fighter in the spring of 1943, the battlefield introduced yet another challenge. The Thunderbolt could not turn with German fighters. It could not climb with them at lower altitudes. And in those opening weeks, losses mounted while victories remained painfully rare. To the Luftwaffe, this merely confirmed what they already believed. The Americans had brought a mistaken idea into the skies of Europe. A machine too big, too heavy, too slow. A fighter that did not deserve the name. What they missed in those first chaotic months was the subtle shift already taking shape. The P-47 was surviving hits that would have torn their own aircraft apart. And it was carrying a weapon system whose full consequence had not yet been felt. The storm had not arrived, but its first shadow had already crossed the horizon. The turning point arrived not with a victory, but with a survival that should have been impossible. On a June morning in 1943, as a formation of P-47s crossed the coast of France, the Germans struck with the efficiency of hunters who knew their prey. 16 FW-190s descended from the sun, their cannon shells walking across the sky. In seconds, a young American pilot named Robert S. Johnson found himself inside a cockpit shredded by fire, his canopy shattered, his instruments failing, and his own blood pooling beneath him. By every rule of air combat, his flight should have ended there. Instead, the Thunderbolt held together, vibrating, burning, refusing to surrender. When a lone FW-190 dove behind him and emptied its entire arsenal into the wounded aircraft, the German pilot expected nothing more than drifting wreckage. What he saw instead was a machine that absorbed every shell, every burst, and still clawed forward toward the channel. When Johnson finally landed in England, crews stopped counting the holes after reaching 200. In that wreckage lay the first undeniable proof of what the aircraft truly was. While the Germans laughed at its size, the Americans began discovering its logic. The Thunderbolt did not win by matching the turn radius of the FW-190 or the climb of the BF-119. It won by imposing a new geometry on aerial combat.
Right on impact.
High above 25,000 feet, where German engines gasped for air, the P-47 remained powerful and steady. In a dive, nothing in the European sky could follow it. That weight, mocked only weeks earlier, became a weapon when converted into speed. It was during these months that commanders like Hubert Zemke and Walker Bud Maheron reshaped the way American pilots fought. Rather than duel in tight circles, they climbed to the edge of the stratosphere, waited, and struck with the violence of falling steel. They called it boom and zoom. German pilots had another name for it, the moment the sky collapsed. At the bottom of those dives, 8 heavy machine guns spoke at once, their streams of fire converging into a 6-foot sphere of destruction. Anything entering that sphere did not simply fall, it came apart. The mission over Schweinfurt and Regensburg revealed this truth with brutal clarity. When a flight of P-47s intercepted BF-110s poised to attack American bombers, the German formation disintegrated in seconds. Witnesses described wings tearing away, fuselages shredding into metal fragments, aircraft vanishing as though erased from the air. It was not grace. It was not elegance. It was industrial firepower distilled into a fighter-sized frame. By late summer, reports inside the Luftwaffe began shifting in tone. Pilots returning from combat described Thunderbolts diving faster than they believed physics allowed, climbing with new confidence, and delivering fire so dense that survival depended more on luck than skill. The enemy had not changed their aircraft, they had changed the way they used it. And slowly, the balance of the European sky began to tilt. The machine once dismissed as a flying milk bottle was becoming something else entirely. Not a predator defined by agility, but a force defined by inevitability. The kind of weapon that did not need to win the first fight to dominate the war that followed. The real shift in the air war became unmistakable in the autumn of 1943, when altitude itself turned from a German advantage into a German weakness. At 28,000 feet and above, the once dominant FW-190s and BF-109s began to lose their breath. Their engines, superb at medium altitude, struggled in the thinning air. Controls felt heavy.
The German pilot
climb rate faded.
Messerschmitt 100
The horizon narrowed into a place where seconds mattered.
wing tanks,
It was in this unforgiving layer of sky that Hans Philipp, one of Germany's most decorated aces, met the Thunderbolt on its own terms. His record was extraordinary. More than 200 victories across the eastern and western fronts, a pilot whose instincts had been sharpened by years of survival. But experience could not
6,000 armored
compensate for
fighting
physics.
vehicles destroyed.
When the P-47s of the 56th Fighter Group dropped into the fight from above, they arrived with a momentum Philip could neither match nor escape. A burst of 50 caliber fire traced across his aircraft, and in an instant, the FW-190 disintegrated into flame and fragments. For the Luftwaffe, it was not just the loss of a pilot. It was the loss of certainty. Headquarters demanded answers. Investigations followed. The reports climbing their way to Gring's desk were stark. The American fighter surpassed German types at altitude, possessed structural integrity beyond expectation, and delivered firepower that outmatched cannon-equipped interceptors in sustained combat. The message beneath the technical jargon was simple. The Luftwaffe no longer controlled the sky. Then came an even more troubling development. The Thunderbolt evolved. With the introduction of the paddle blade propeller on the P-47D variants, climb rate surged. Acceleration improved. The machine that had once lumbered through the lower atmosphere now punched upward with surprising strength. German pilots, accustomed to bouncing the Americans from above, found themselves confronted by a fighter that could close the vertical gap. Engagements once dictated by the Luftwaffe now belonged to whoever held the most altitude and nerve, and increasingly, that was the Thunderbolt. By the time Allied planners began shaping the invasion of France, the P-47 had grown into a new role, one that would carve its reputation into the memory of every soldier who fought beneath it. The same guns that tore apart fighters now shredded convoys, rail lines, tank columns, and supply routes. When the first waves landed at Normandy on June 6, 1944, more than 500 Thunderbolts patrolled the beaches. German aircraft that attempted to break through found the sky stacked with American fighters from sea level to the edge of the stratosphere. Survivors from the Luftwaffe remembered the experience with a kind of quiet horror. A single pass from a P-47 could erase a column of vehicles. The sound of its diving engine became a warning no one could outrun. Troops spoke of the earth erupting beneath them, of trucks turning into fireballs, of the sudden brutal silence after a burst of 50 caliber rounds tore the world apart. And beneath these battlefield moments lay a deeper truth. The Luftwaffe was no longer fighting for air superiority. It was fighting for survival. Every day the Thunderbolt remained in the sky, that survival slipped further from reach. What separated the United States from its enemy was not simply the design of a single fighter, but the philosophy that produced it. American planners did not view air power as a contest of dueling aces. They saw it as an industrial campaign, a struggle where logistics, training, and production mattered as much as tactics. The Thunderbolt, with its heavy frame and relentless firepower, was the natural expression of that worldview. Factories in New York and Indiana delivered aircraft at a pace that astonished even Allied commanders. What the Luftwaffe destroyed in a morning raid could be replaced by the following day. Skilled mechanics kept squadrons flying with an abundance of spare parts. Pilots trained with ammunition and fuel in quantities German units could only imagine. When an American fighter group arrived in theater, its airmen carried hundreds of hours of training, disciplined formation practice, and a deep familiarity with their aircraft. German trainees by 1944 often entered combat with fewer than 100 hours of total flight time. As P-47 units shifted into their expanded roles, the broader world began to grasp the implications. Allies understood that American air power no longer relied on individual brilliance, but on a system capable of sustained pressure. Intercepting bombers, guarding the beaches of Normandy, hunting armored columns, or escorting formations deep into Germany became parts of a single unified strategy. Air superiority was not the goal. It was the foundation upon which every other operation rested. For the Luftwaffe, this transformation was devastating. The more Germany struggled, the more the American system intensified. Operation Bodenplatte, the desperate New Year's Day offensive of 1945, illustrated the imbalance with painful clarity. German fighters destroyed dozens of American aircraft on the ground, but their victory evaporated within hours as replacement Thunderbolts rolled off transports and onto fresh hard stands. The Luftwaffe, already crippled by fuel shortages and the loss of veteran pilots, had no such reserve. Each fallen aviator represented experience that could never be replaced. By the end of the war, German commanders themselves spoke openly of the strategic lessons. They admitted that courage and tactical skill could not overcome a nation capable of creating overwhelming strength in the air, mission after mission, month after month. The world, watching from the ruins of Europe and the Pacific, understood the message clearly. Modern warfare belonged not to the aircraft that dazzled in a turning fight, but to the machine backed by a system powerful enough to sustain it. In the final months of the war, when the skies above Europe grew quiet and the smoke began to thin, the Thunderbolt stood as more than a machine of metal and fire. It had become a symbol of a different kind of strength, the kind built not from elegance or agility, but from endurance, discipline, and the vast industrial will of a nation determined to shape the course of history. The aircraft that once drew laughter now carried the weight of countless missions, countless lives saved, and countless stories that would echo long after the guns fell silent. For the pilots who flew it, the P-47 was never merely a fighter. It was a companion in the most unforgiving hours of their lives, a shield forged from American industry, and a reminder that survival often depended on the margin between what a machine could endure and what a human heart could carry. Many returned home with memories of the thunderous dive, the trembling airframe, and the steady rhythm of those 8 .50 caliber guns. Others did not return at all, but their legacy remains woven into the steel of every surviving Thunderbolt and the stories told around it. For their adversaries, the memory was different. German pilots who once mocked the bulky silhouette later spoke of the dread that settled in their stomachs when they heard its unmistakable roar. On the ground, soldiers remembered the shadow passing over a road or a field, followed by a storm of fire that changed the course of a battle before anyone could react. The transformation from ridicule to fear was not gradual. It was absolute. Today, when visitors walk through museums and stand before the restored aircraft, they see a war machine at rest, its paint polished, its story condensed to placards and quiet displays. But the truth runs deeper. The P-47 tells the story of a nation discovering that its greatest power lay not only in invention, but in the ability to build, supply, train, and sustain on a scale the world had never seen. It is a reminder that wars are won not only by moments of heroism, but by systems that rise to meet the demands of history. And perhaps that is the lasting lesson of the Thunderbolt, that strength, when paired with purpose, becomes something greater than the sum of its parts. As you reflect on its journey, consider what this story reveals about resilience, sacrifice, and the choices that shape the modern world. If you found meaning in this story, share your thoughts. What part of the Thunderbolt's legacy speaks to you most deeply? And what lesson from this era do you believe still matters today? They never saw the planes coming. Not in the quiet hour before dawn, not in the proud winter morning when Tokyo believed the war was already won. But on that day in 1942, as the sirens wailed over a city that had never imagined fear, Japan discovered a truth it was not prepared to face. The Americans were only beginning to fight. The war had moved swiftly across the Pacific too swiftly, some whispered inside the Japanese high command. Victories in the Philippines, Malaya, Hong Kong, and the Dutch East Indies had created an illusion of inevitability. Streets in Tokyo echoed with confidence. Newspapers declared destiny. Admirals spoke of conquest measured in months, not years. But beneath that triumph, a question lingered on that only a handful of leaders dared to voice. What happens when a nation built on industry, endurance, and sheer resolve decides to rise from its greatest defeat? The answer arrived not as an armada, not as an invasion, but as a handful of B-25 bombers carving their way across the Pacific. A mission so improbable that even its pilots expected not to return. A strike so small that it barely scratched the city it hit yet shook an empire to its core. Because sometimes history turns not on the size of a blow, but on what it forces a nation to see. The Pacific in early 1942 was a map stamped by Japanese victories. From the shores of Malaya to the ruins of Manila, the imperial banners rose with astonishing speed. To the outside world, it looked like a new empire being carved in months of campaign, so swift that even seasoned analysts in Washington and London struggled to comprehend how completely the balance of power had shifted. Inside Japan's command circles, however, the mood was more complicated. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of the Pearl Harbor strike, understood better than most what the empire had awakened. He had studied in the United States. He had walked American streets, seen its factories, and respected its industrial potential. Victories could be won quickly, yes, but wars of endurance were another matter. And the United States, he warned, excelled at endurance. Yet Japan celebrated as if the war were already decided. Reports from the Philippines, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies painted a picture of unstoppable advance. Troops moved with practiced precision. Airfields fell one after another. Supply lines seemed secure. The Imperial General Staff spoke openly about expanding deeper into the Pacific, into Australia, into the Indian Ocean, anywhere momentum pointed them. But Yamamoto knew momentum was not a plan, and victory was not a guarantee. Within Tokyo's highest councils, rival visions clashed. Army firebrands demanded further expansion, convinced that America was soft, incapable of sustaining a long war. Their confidence grew with each broadcast praising the empire's conquests. In their eyes, hesitation was weakness. Yamamoto stood on the other side of that divide. He insisted that Japan had 18 months no more to force a negotiated settlement. Every additional front opened, every distant island seized, drained the precious resources Japan could not replenish. Oil reserves, shipyards, trained pilots, these were not infinite. He warned that after the initial wave of triumph, the empire would be overstretched, exposed, and vulnerable. But caution in wartime Tokyo was a dangerous virtue. Friends worried that open dissent could cost Yamamoto his life. Some urged him to stay aboard his flagship, the Yamato, where the reach of political extremists could not easily find him. Even there, the admiral worked under the weight of a reality few wanted to acknowledge. Japan had woken a nation far larger and far more capable than its early victories suggested. While Japan debated its future, the United States faced its own reckoning. Pearl Harbor had torn through America's sense of security, but the carriers survived, and in those decks lay the seeds of a new kind of war. Factories roared to life. Training programs accelerated. What the nation lacked in immediate strength, it compensated with resolve. But America needed something more than preparation. It needed a Spartan act bold enough to tell the world that the United States was not beaten. That spark would come from a plan so daring it bordered on impossible, launching land-based bombers from a carrier to strike the Japanese home islands. A mission with long odds, no guarantees, and no clear path home. Yet it was precisely the kind of mission that could shift the moral weight of a war. And it would. The raid reached Tokyo in minutes, but its shockwaves traveled much farther. When Jimmy Doolittle's B-25 bombers lifted off the USS Hornet and struck the Japanese mainland, the physical damage was limited, but the psychological impact was seismic. For the first time in centuries, the Japanese homeland had been breached. Sirens echoed through neighborhoods that had believed themselves untouchable. Civilians scrambled for shelter. The myth of invulnerability, nurtured by months of triumph, cracked in a single morning. Inside Japan's military command, the response was immediate and visceral. The raid was not simply an embarrassment, it was an omen. Yamamoto understood what it signified. If a handful of American aircraft could penetrate the home islands now, what would they be capable of in a year? 2 years? And if the Americans were bold enough to attempt such a mission so early in the war, what ferocity would they unleash once their full industrial might came online? This realization ignited the most consequential strategic shift of the Pacific War. Japan's leadership felt compelled to respond with a decisive blow, something so spectacular it would restore confidence at home and intimidate the United States into negotiating. Yamamoto proposed the operation he believed would achieve this, a sweeping ambush near a small atoll the world barely knew. Midway. The logic was simple: lure the remaining American carriers into a trap, crush them, and slam the Pacific door shut before the United States could rebuild. It would be a replay of Pearl Harbor, but this time on Yamamoto's terms. Powerful fleet carriers, battleships, cruisers, and destroyers were assembled for the operation. Thousands of sailors prepared for what many believed would be the culminating battle of the war. Yet the very urgency created by the Doolittle raid also led to mistakes. Japan rushed the plan. Intelligence estimates were optimistic. Communications grew fragmented. Key units were dispatched simultaneously to the Aleutians in a diversion that diluted strength. The empire was stretching itself thin at the moment it most needed cohesion. Across the ocean, the United States was reading signals literally. Cryptanalysts at Station Hypo had broken critical portions of Japan's naval code. They knew Midway was the target. They knew the timing. And they understood that this was the opportunity America had been waiting for. When the battle came in June 1942, it unfolded with chaotic intensity. American dive bombers descended on Japanese carriers at the precise moment their decks were cluttered with refueling aircraft and armed torpedoes. In less than an hour, 3 of Japan's frontline carriers were aflame. The 4th followed soon after. A single desperate strike by Doolittle's raiders, small in scale, almost symbolic, had set off a chain reaction that tore apart the core of Japan's naval aviation. Midway was more than a defeat. It was a strategic amputation. 4 carriers gone, hundreds of elite pilots lost, irreplaceable mechanics and deck crews wiped out. Japan's offensive momentum, built over months, stalled in a single week. And into that vacuum of power, a new battle would soon emerge. One fought not in the open ocean, but on a remote island where jungle, rain, and sheer will would test every soldier who touched its shores. That place was Guadalcanal. Approximately 500 words, turning points and consequences, the shift, the failures, the human and material costs. The aftermath of Midway did not bring clarity to the Japanese high command. Instead, it produced a silence that concealed the scale of the disaster. News of the 4 lost carriers was restricted to the highest naval circles. Officers in the field, soldiers on distant islands, and even many senior commanders continued to believe the operation had been a success. This illusion carried Japan forward into one of the most difficult campaigns of the war. With the carrier force damaged but not fully acknowledged as crippled,
Good group we
Japan
have here today.
accelerated its push
Best, sir.
southward. The plan was bold and, on paper, logical. By seizing New Guinea and the Solomon Islands, Japanese forces could sever the lifeline between the United States and Australia. If Australia were isolated, Allied operations in the Pacific would collapse into logistical strain. It was a strategy that sought to regain momentum through geography and pressure, even as Japan was losing its irreplaceable naval aviation strength. The center of this strategy became a remote island with thick jungles, rising ridges, and a patch of coastline large enough to host a new airfield. That island was Guadalcanal. To Japan, the airfield promised dominance over the shipping lanes that fed Australia. To the United States, the same airfield represented a threat that could not be ignored. When American reconnaissance confirmed its construction in mid-1942, the implications were immediate. If Japan completed and defended the airfield, the Allies would face a hostile base directly on their supply route. Despite shortages of carriers, aircraft, trained crews, and amphibious experience, the United States decided to strike before the runway could become fully operational. The landings on Guadalcanal in August 1942 marked the first major American offensive of the Pacific War. For many of the Marines who stepped onto the beach, it was a moment of tense uncertainty. They had trained for this moment, but few had ever experienced combat. The jungle was thick, visibility limited, and the enemy silent. Yet within the first hours, American troops captured the unfinished airfield almost without resistance. That early success carried a dangerous temptation to underestimate the struggle ahead. Across the water, on the islands of Tulagi, Gavutu, and Tanambogo, the situation was far different. There, seasoned Japanese units fought with unyielding intensity. Defensive positions were carved into hillsides. Machine guns were positioned to create overlapping fields of fire. Snipers hid in trees, caves, and collapsed structures. Every movement forward demanded coordinated assaults, grenades, satchel charges, and constant alertness. Casualties rose sharply. The Marines began to understand that this would not be an easy campaign or a short one. Every ridge and ravine held danger. Every yard of ground required effort and sacrifice. As air battles erupted above the island and naval engagements flared in the surrounding waters, it became clear that Guadalcanal was no longer a limited operation. It was becoming a struggle for control of the entire southern Pacific. Supplies piled on beaches under constant threat. Pilots fought long missions with little rest. Sailors braced for night battles with an enemy skilled in darkness. Soldiers on the ground discovered the full cost of a campaign defined not by sweeping maneuvers, but by endurance, attrition, and the constant presence of danger. The consequences were profound. Guadalcanal forced Japan into a grinding contest it could not sustain. It forced the United States to adapt rapidly, learning amphibious warfare, jungle survival, and inter-service coordination under fire. And it revealed a truth that would shape the rest of the Pacific War. Victory would not come from quick strikes or single battles. It would come from resilience, from logistics, and from the willingness to withstand months of hardship in a place where nothing came easily. Approximately 400 words, American and global perspectives, strategic lessons, political reactions, and the changing course of the Pacific War. For the United States, Guadalcanal was more than a military operation. It was a declaration that the nation had moved beyond shock and recovery and had entered a new phase of determination. The early months after Pearl Harbor had been defined by defense, emergency measures, and the steady retreat of Allied positions across the Pacific. Guadalcanal changed that trajectory. It signaled that the United States was prepared not only to resist, but to seize the initiative, even when the balance of forces was still uncertain. American leaders understood what this shift meant. General Douglas MacArthur viewed the campaign as a lifeline to Australia, a guarantee that the Allies would retain a forward base indispensable to future operations. Admiral Chester Nimitz recognized Guadalcanal as a laboratory in which the Navy and Marine Corps were forced to adapt to new realities: integrated amphibious warfare, constant air pressure, and the complexities of fighting across thousands of miles of ocean. Each day on the island produced new lessons in logistics, coordination, and endurance. Within the broader Allied community, the reaction was equally significant. Australia, which had feared isolation after the fall of Singapore and the attacks on Darwin, saw Guadalcanal as tangible proof that the United States would commit its strength to the defense of the region. British observers, still recovering from setbacks in Asia, noted that American persistence on a remote island contrasted sharply with Japan's earlier momentum. Even far from the Pacific, in capitals across Europe, analysts marked the shift as evidence that the Axis offensive had finally reached its limit. Japan's response revealed a different perspective. While official broadcasts minimized the scale of the fighting, internal communications reflected growing concern. The loss of initiative was unmistakable. What had begun as a strategy to isolate Australia had become a defensive effort to hold ground that consumed ships, aircraft, and veteran troops. As the fighting intensified, Japanese commanders requested reinforcements that could not be spared. Naval officers began to worry about fuel supplies, aircrew shortages, and the increasing effectiveness of American intelligence. The Empire was discovering the cumulative weight of a long war it had not fully prepared to fight. The global significance of Guadalcanal lay not only in the battles themselves, but in what they represented. For the first time in the Pacific War, the Allies had halted a Japanese advance and forced the enemy into a prolonged struggle. The campaign exposed weaknesses in Japan's strategy and highlighted the strength of American industrial support even in the early stages. It underscored that future victories would depend on patience, coordination, and the capacity to endure hardship as much as on bold tactics or sudden strikes. In this sense, Guadalcanal was a turning point, not because it ended the war, but because it reshaped expectations. The world saw that the Allies could contest the initiative. Japan realized that early victories were not guarantees of long-term success. And the United States proved that it could carry the burden of a grinding campaign far from home, setting the foundation for the long road ahead. Approximately 400 words ending historical legacy, emotional reflection, and CTA. The story of the Doolittle raid, Midway, and Guadalcanal is not simply a sequence of battles. It is a record of how small actions can redirect the course of a vast war and how determination can turn doubt into forward momentum. The raid itself caused little physical damage, yet it became a catalyst, forcing Japan into choices that carried heavy consequences. Midway followed, reshaping the balance of naval power. Guadalcanal came next, demanding endurance, sacrifice, and a new understanding of what the Pacific War would require from those who fought it. For the Americans who landed on those beaches in 1942, the cost was measured not in strategy charts, but in long nights, heavy humidity, and the constant presence of danger. Many had never seen combat before stepping onto the island. By the time the campaign ended, they had lived through shortages, disease, sudden air raids, and the steady pressure of a determined enemy. Their experience became a foundation for everything that followed in the Pacific theater. They proved that the United States could fight on unfamiliar terrain, far from home, against a skilled and relentless opponent. For Japan, These events marked the end of the rapid advance that had defined the early war. They revealed the limits of momentum and exposed the strategic risk of misreading an opponent. The empire entered a new phase in which resources no longer stretched to meet ambition and where each decision carried consequences that could not be hidden or reversed. The confidence that had defined the winter of 1942 gave way to the sobering reality that the war would not end quickly or on favorable terms. The legacy of these interconnected moments extends beyond the battlefield. They remind us that turning points often appear unexpectedly. A small raid can alter calculations. A lost carrier can reshape strategy. A remote island barely known to most Americans can become the stage on which a nation's resolve is tested and proven. These events taught future generations that power is not measured only in numbers, but in endurance, leadership, and the willingness to adapt in the face of hardship. As we look back, the question that remains is not only what happened, but what it meant. What do these battles tell us about the cost of war, the nature of courage, and the decisions that shape history? If this story made you think about the hidden turning points of the past, consider sharing your thoughts. What moment in this campaign stands out to you as the most decisive? And if you want to explore more stories that shape the world we live in, join us for the next chapter in our journey through military history. Night had settled over the Texas plains, but the darkness outside the train window was drowned beneath a river of electric light. House after house, street after street, the glow cut through the warm June air like a quiet declaration of power. Unificia Vera Burkhart pressed his forehead to the glass, his breath fogging the pain, and wrote a single line into the diary he kept hidden from his fellow officers. No nation at war should live like this. He had grown used to the blacked-out towns of Germany, to the fear of a sky that might ignite at any moment under British bombs. Yet, here an ocean away from the collapsing Reich farmhouse shone like it had something to prove. Even at this late hour, neon signs hummed, warehouse windows glowed, and long rows of telephone poles carved bright pathways into the night. These men had been soldiers of the Afrika Korps, hardened by years of sand, hunger, and retreat. But nothing in the desert had prepared them for this first glimpse of America land whose ordinary lights seemed to whisper that their war was already lost. What else waited for them beyond those illuminated streets? And how much of what they had believed would survive the journey ahead? The collapse began long before the prisoners ever saw a single American town. It started in the dust and heat of Tunisia, when the Afrika Korps, the same units that had once pushed the British back to the gates of Egypt, found themselves surrounded, starving, and out of fuel. On May 13, 1943, General Jürgen von Arnim surrendered 250,000 German and Italian soldiers, ending the last Axis resistance in North Africa. For many of these men, it felt less like a military defeat and more like an unraveling of the world they thought they understood. In the makeshift holding camps near Oran, Algeria, the unraveling quickened. Thousands of prisoners were processed each day with a level of precision they had once believed belonged only to Germany. Cameras clicked. Medical forms were filled. Vaccinations were administered by American officers speaking fluent German officers trained specifically for this moment. These gestures, simple as they were, carried an unsettling message. Their captors were better organized than the Reich at its peak. But the first true fracture in their beliefs came with the food. Men who had grown thin on desert rations, dried biscuits, watery soups, and whatever could be scavenged found themselves holding trays of white bread, real coffee, and meat served twice a day. Some whispered that the Americans were staging a performance, preparing a deception. Others doubted even that. No one could understand how a nation fighting a global war could afford to treat enemies this well. Then came the Liberty ships. To the POWs, they appeared as nothing more than cargo vessels waiting to take them across the Atlantic. They had no idea these ships were themselves symbols of American power, steel hulls, constructed in days rather than months, rolling off assembly lines with a speed that defied logic. Only after conversations with American guards did the realization seep in 3 of these ships were being launched every day. Each carried parts from dozens of factories in dozens of states, a national web of production Germany could no longer match. The crossing delivered its own revelations. POWs watched sailors casually discard more food in a single day than some German units had seen in a week. They learned that the vessel carrying them was one of 2,710 Liberty ships built during the war, each requiring 250,000 components. They walked the deck beneath a rotating radar antenna, a technology they had believed was scarce even among their own elite units. And in the quiet moments of the voyage, men who had sworn loyalty to the Reich began to sense a grim truth. America was not the weak, divided nation of Nazi propaganda. It was something far more dangerous, a nation whose industrial strength seemed endless. By the time land finally appeared on the horizon, they were no longer expecting to find a struggling republic. But nothing, not the defeat in Africa, not the abundance on the ship, could prepare them for what awaited on the American coast. When the Liberty ship finally eased into Norfolk Naval Base, the prisoners looked upon a scene that felt less like a harbor and more like a revelation. Crane after crane swung effortlessly over miles of docks, lifting steel containers with electric power that moved smooth as breath. 47 cargo ships lay in various stages of loading and unloading, each dwarfing the next. The entire port functioned like a single organism, precise, tireless, and impossibly vast. Many of the men had worked in Germany's industrial centers before the war. None had seen anything like this. Hamburg, the pride of the Reich, could not match a single day of Norfolk's traffic. From the moment they stepped onto American soil, the myth of a weak, disorganized America began to die. Yet the real destruction of Nazi illusions would come not in the ports, but on the rails. The prisoners boarded Pullman car cars with padded seats, sleeping berths, silverware, and dining service. Even the guards apologized that the air conditioning might not be working properly, a concept so absurd that some POWs believed it was sarcasm. But it wasn't. It was simply normal. As the trains rolled inland, the transformation deepened. Night after night, the prisoners pressed their faces to the glass, watching towns blaze with light. Tiny communities, Martinsville, Danville, Greensboro glowed like cities, their storefronts illuminated, their factories running second and third shifts. In Germany, entire regions had been dark since 1940. Here, electricity flowed into every street and every window. A single railway yard consumed more power in 1 hour than many districts of Berlin used in a day. Then came the factories. The Alcoa plant in Tennessee stretched for miles along the river, its furnaces devouring more electricity than Munich itself. In Louisville, 4 synthetic rubber plants built in only 18 months towered over fields that had been empty the year before. German engineers on the train recognized the machinery instantly. Catalytic crackers, distillation columns, polymerization units. But what stunned them was not the technology, it was the scale. Each plant was larger than anything Germany had ever built, and there were dozens more across the country. And looming above all of it was Willow Run. Even from the train tracks, the factory dominated the horizon. 5 million square feet of steel and glass producing a B-24 Liberator every 63 minutes. Prisoners counted the bombers visible through the open doors, fuselages, wings, engines lined up in stages of assembly. At its peak, 42,000 workers, many of them women, operated the plant. The Germans had been told American aircraft were inferior, built hastily by amateurs. Yet here, even through a brief passing view, they saw workmanship that contradicted every word of Nazi propaganda. These machines were not inferior. They were simply produced faster than anything Germany could imagine. The deeper the trains traveled into America, the clearer the truth became. They were moving through a nation mobilized not by coercion, but by capacity. Factories roared, rail lines pulsed, farms stretched to horizons that seemed unreal. This was not just industrial power, it was industrial confidence, the kind that could fight a war on two fronts without dimming a single light bulb. And as the POWs watched this world pass beyond the windows, a single thought settled over them. Germany had challenged a giant it never truly understood. The shock of American abundance did not end with the train ride. It deepened the moment the prisoners stepped through the gates of Camp Hearn in Texas, a facility built in 4 months yet equipped with comforts that many German civilians had never known. Barracks held electric lights, flush toilets, steam heat, and hot showers. The camp hospital contained X-ray machines, surgical tools, and medicine that German doctors had not seen since 1941. When Dr. Friedrich Bauer first examined the supply room, he paused at a box of penicillin, a drug so scarce in Germany that it had become the subject of rumor. Here, it was used freely, even for minor infections, even for prisoners. In the kitchens, the revelations were just as unsettling. Walk-in refrigerators hummed beside gas ranges large enough to feed 5,000 men. Automated mixers stirred dough, while dishwashers cleaned stacks of trays in minutes. German cooks assigned to kitchen duty discovered that regulations required 10% overproduction for every meal to ensure no prisoner went hungry. The excess perfectly good bred vegetables meat was thrown away. Feldwebel Otto Krebs wept as he discarded loaves that would have fed his family for a week. By autumn 1943, the labor shortage across the United States brought prisoners out of the camps and into the American heartland. They rode trucks without blindfolds, passing through towns that looked impossibly prosperous, homes with refrigerators and radios, shops full of goods, parking lots filled with cars. At cotton gins near Houston, a single machine processed more fiber in 1 hour than entire villages in Germany could handle in a month. In the fields of Nebraska, combines harvested wheat at a speed that felt unreal on machine doing the work of 100 men. Farmers spoke casually of yields that would have seemed fantastical in Bavaria or Prussia. Factories revealed an even harsher truth. At the Campbell Soup Plant in New Jersey, conveyors and automatic fillers performed the work of 50 German laborers under the watch of a single elderly woman sipping coffee. In Ohio, the blast furnaces of Republic Steel roared day and night, producing more steel in one plant than the entire Ruhr region at its wartime peak. And at the Higgins Boat Factory in New Orleans, prisoners watched women weld hulls and teenagers operate drilling machines, each shift producing landing craft by the hundreds. Everything the Nazis had declared impossible for democracies was happening in front of their eyes and happening efficiently. The psychological impact became impossible to hide. Major Paul Newland's reports described ideological collapse syndrome, fanatical Nazis falling silent, loyalists questioning everything they had been told. The treatment of Italian prisoners after Italy's surrender deepened the fracture. Italians who cooperated with the Allies earned wages, ate in American restaurants, and enjoyed freedoms unthinkable in Germany. German soldiers watched, stunned, as former Allies were treated with a dignity the Reich had never offered them. Then came Christmas. More than 500,000 care packages arrived from churches and civic groups, cigarettes, candy, toiletries, game sent to men who had tried to kill American sons months earlier. Choirs sang carols in German. Mothers from nearby towns baked cakes for the prisoners. The meal itself, turkey, ham, vegetables, pies, and ice cream, exceeded anything the men had eaten since before the war. Some grew ill from eating too quickly, unable to believe such abundance was ordinary. And yet, the final blow would not come from generosity, but from truth. In 1945, as American forces liberated the concentration camps, the footage was shown to German prisoners. Many refused to believe it at first, but the images, the testimony, the letters from home all aligned. What shattered that day was not merely faith in victory, but faith in the moral foundation of the Reich. Men who had endured defeat now confronted something far heavier, the knowledge that they had fought for a lie. From the American perspective, the transformation of German prisoners was never an accident. It emerged from a deliberate philosophy that treated strength not as the ability to crush an enemy, but as the capacity to demonstrate a better way to live. The United States understood that industrial power alone could win battles, but only a combination of abundance and dignity could win mines. And in the crowded camps scattered across 45 states, that philosophy unfolded with quiet precision. At the center of this effort stood the Special Projects Division, a small but influential arm of the Provost Marshal General's office. Its mission was simple: allow German prisoners to see America for what it truly was. No forced indoctrination, no slogans, no punishments for dissent. Instead, the program offered access to newspapers, libraries, lectures, and camp-run newspapers edited by anti-Nazi prisoners. Education became the battlefield where democracy proved its resilience. Over time, discussion shifted from bitterness and denial to economics, constitutional government, and the possibilities of a Germany rebuilt on entirely different foundations. For American strategists, this shift had profound implications. A future Germany aligned with democratic principles was essential to post-war stability and essential to preventing another nationalist revival. By granting prisoners an unfiltered view of American industry and society, the United States aimed to plant the seeds of Reconstruction before the war had even ended. The approach contrasted sharply with the brutality of Nazi occupation policies. Where the Reich ruled by fear, America ruled by example. Where Nazi propaganda demanded obedience, American prosperity invited curiosity. Beyond America's borders, the effect spread quietly. British and French observers recognized the power of this model, especially as German prisoners began writing home about their experiences. The stories of abundance, opportunity, and tolerance traveled back across the Atlantic, undermining the last fragments of Nazi credibility. And after the war, when the Marshall Plan was announced, it found a receptive audience among former POWs who had already witnessed the potential of democratic capitalism firsthand. These prisoners would later help shape the institutions that defined post-war Europe, a unified Western alliance, a stable West German republic, and an economy rebuilt on efficiency rather than coercion. Their conversion patient, voluntary, and grounded in lived reality became one of the most subtle victories of the war. In the eyes of American planners, this was proof of something deeper, that the true strength of the United States lay not only in its production lines or military power, but in its ability to transform enemies into partners through the quiet force of its own example. In the end, the journey of the German prisoners of war became something far greater than a wartime footnote. It became a testament to the quiet power of a society confident enough to treat its enemies with dignity, wealthy enough to feed them generously, and strong enough to reveal its flaws without fear. What the prisoners witnessed across railways and farmlands, factories, and camp libraries was a different kind of might, a civilian strength built not on conquest, but on creation. For men raised on the certainties of Nazi ideology, this revelation reshaped everything. They saw that prosperity did not require oppression, that unity did not require fear, that freedom, when paired with opportunity, could produce more steel, more food, more innovation, and more hope than any authoritarian dream. Some understood this truth in the glow of American cities that never dimmed. Others grasped it in the quiet of camp classrooms, where professors taught physics and history to men who had once marched under the swastika. And for many, the moment came in a simple act of kindness, an American church sending Christmas gifts to strangers who had fought on the wrong side of history. When these men returned to Germany, they carried more than memories. They carried a blueprint. Their experiences in the United States influenced the rebuilding of towns, the reform of industries, and the emergence of a democratic society determined to never again confuse tyranny with strength. The economic miracle that followed was not born from American aid alone, but from the lessons absorbed in those camps: efficiency, fairness, innovation, and the belief that the dignity of ordinary people is the foundation of national power. Today, their story echoes as a reminder that the most enduring victories are not won on battlefields, but in minds and hearts. That abundance can be more persuasive than ideology, and that humanity, even in war, can reshape the future in ways no weapon ever could. So, as we reflect on this extraordinary transformation from captured soldiers to architects of a new Germany, we are left with a question that reaches far beyond World War II. What kind of world becomes possible when strength is used not to dominate, but to inspire? If you have thoughts on this journey, or if it reminds you of a story from your own family's wartime past, share it below. History lives on through the voices that remember it. On a quiet August evening in 1944, long after the guns had faded and the dust of retreating armies hung in the air, a strange sound drifted across the French countryside. It wasn't the roar of tanks or the shriek of artillery. It was the steady growing hum of engines, thousands of them rolling through the night like a river of steel cutting across a wounded land. To German commanders studying their maps miles away, such a sound should have been impossible. According to every rule of European warfare, an army that outran its supplies was an army already defeated. Distance was supposed to be the great equalizer, the line every advancing force eventually could not cross. By their calculations, the Americans had crossed it days earlier. Yet something was moving out there in the darkness. Something they had not prepared for. How did an army that should have been immobilized by mathematics continue to accelerate across France? And who were the many of them, young, exhausted, and denied full rights in their own country, who kept those engines roaring through the night? The answer was a logistics miracle the German General Staff never imagined. But history remembers it by a simpler name, the Red Ball Express. Long before the Red Ball Express carved its path across France, German commanders believed they already understood the limits of mechanized war. They had learned those limits the hard way. On the vast steppes of Russia, their panzers had surged forward only to stall when roads dissolved into mud, when horses, still the backbone of their transport, lagged behind steel columns, and when railway tracks of the wrong gauge trapped supplies hundreds of miles from the front. To the Wehrmacht, logistics wasn't an abstract concern. It was the force that had strangled their greatest offensives. And now, in the summer of 1944, they believed the Americans were about to meet the same fate. From East Prussia, German staff officers studied the terrifying speed of Patton's Third Army, 12 divisions pushing more than 400 miles in little more than a month. No army in European memory had moved like this, but the numbers the Germans believed made the situation unsustainable. An armored division needed 150,000 gallons of fuel each day. An infantry division required 700 tons of supplies. An armored division demanded 1,000. Patton commanded 12 of them. The math seemed absolute. The Americans had crossed a distance that no amount of optimism could overcome. The laws of physics, as one German general wrote, cannot be violated, not even by American industry. Meanwhile, along the shattered roads of northern France, the Americans saw a different kind of problem. The rail network was ruined. Bridges were blown apart. Depots were too far behind to support the pace of the advance. Traditional logistics, slow, scheduled, procedurally perfect, had collapsed under the weight of American momentum. Something new was needed, something no manual had ever described. On August 25, 1944, inside a requisitioned French chateau, a small group of exhausted officers gathered around Lieutenant Colonel Loren Ayres of the Motor Transport Service. Their chart showed the problem plainly. Patton was consuming supplies faster than any army in history. If nothing changed, he would stop within days. But Ayres proposed something that defied doctrine, transforming the roads of France into a one-way, non-stop supply highway running from Cherbourg and the Normandy beaches directly to the front. 20 hours of driving out of every 24. No blackout discipline. Headlights blazing at night. No stopping except for fuel or mechanical failure. A 5-minute interval between convoys. A rolling artery of trucks stretching across the country, feeding an army that refused to slow down. To the officers in that room, the idea sounded reckless. To the Germans, had they heard it, it would have sounded suicidal. But to Ayres, it was the only answer to a simple reality. The war's fastest army needed the war's fastest supply line. And within 36 hours, the impossible had begun to take shape. Thousands of trucks, thousands of men, and a vision of logistics that would rewrite the rules of modern war. When the first convoys rolled out on August 26, 1944, the Red Ball Express did not resemble a traditional military operation. It looked more like an industrial tide unbroken, unrelenting, indifferent to weather, road conditions, or the expectations of European commanders. Two parallel one-way highways cut across France, one for loaded trucks racing toward the front, the other for empty vehicles barreling back to the coast. Military police guarded intersections. Maintenance units leapfrogged forward every 50 miles. And the convoys themselves, 60 or 70 trucks at a time, departed at 5-minute intervals, day and night without pause. The backbone of this system was the GMC CCKW 2-ton truck, the Deuce and a Half, a machine so standardized that American mechanics could swap an engine in 45 minutes under roadside floodlights. But the true force that powered the Red Ball Express was human endurance. Of the 23,000 drivers, roughly 3/4 were African American soldiers serving in a segregated Army young men who were denied entry to restaurants back home, yet were now responsible for keeping Patton's armored divisions alive. They painted names on their trucks: Detroit to Berlin Express, Patton's Blood Bank, Hitler, Here We Come. Within days, they developed an informal culture of speed, grit, and mutual responsibility. If a vehicle slowed below 20 miles per hour, it was pushed into a ditch. The mission came first. German reconnaissance units were the first to realize something extraordinary was happening. Observers stationed along wooded ridges reported an unbroken chain of headlights stretching for 20 kilometers. No blackout discipline. No spacing. Just motion constant, reckless, fearless motion. To the Wehrmacht, this violated every principle of survival. A single artillery strike could have obliterated an entire convoy. A Luftwaffe attack could have turned the roads into burning corridors of wreckage. But the Luftwaffe was crippled. The roads were open, and the Americans seemed to understand something the Germans did not. In modern war, volume could replace caution. As the Red Ball Express hit its rhythm, the impact on the battlefield was immediate. Patton's armored divisions began to move at a pace that stunned both allies and enemies. German doctrine calculated that an armored unit might sustain a 20-mile advance on a perfect day. Yet, with Red Ball trucks waiting at every resupply point, American divisions routinely pushed 40 to 60 miles. On September 1st, the 4th Armored Division advanced 35 miles before noon, refueled from arriving Red Ball convoys, and then drove another 32 miles before sunset. For German officers studying these reports, disbelief became dread. Heinz Guderian, father of Blitzkrieg, refused at first to accept the numbers no machines could endure that many miles in so little time. But the intercepted American radio traffic confirmed it. What the Germans faced was no longer Blitzkrieg as they defined it. It was a form of warfare powered by an industrial engine they had never imagined, a relentless tempo made possible by thousands of drivers who turned the roads of France into a river of fuel, ammunition, and momentum. As Patton's army surged deeper into France, the Red Ball Express began to strain under the very success it had created. Every mile gained on the battlefield added another mile to the trucks behind it, stretching the supply line toward a breaking point no logistics system had ever faced. By early September, a single round trip from the coast to the front exceeded 700 miles. Trucks ran nearly nonstop. Drivers, many barely 20 years old, pushed through exhaustion, hallucinations, and the constant vibration of engines that never cooled. Some remained behind the wheel for 72 hours, their eyes burning, their hands trembling from fatigue and benzodrine. Mechanical failure became a daily certainty. Roughly 1,800 trucks broke down every 24 hours, collapsing under overloaded cargo and shattered suspensions. Maintenance crews turned the roadsides into makeshift workshops, crawling beneath steaming engines in the rain, the darkness, or the rising dust. They developed a triage system, 15 minutes to repair what could be repaired. Anything worse was dragged into a ditch, cannibalized for parts, and abandoned. By late September, over 5,000 vehicles had been consumed by the operation, more trucks than the entire German army possessed in France. The human cost was steeper. Accidents on narrow French roads killed hundreds of drivers. Fog caused chain collisions. Overheated engines ignited beneath fuel tankers. A single mistake on a crowded night convoy could send a truck tumbling into a ravine. Yet morale held. The men knew they were sustaining the fastest advance in Allied history, and many understood something deeper. Every mile they delivered was a blow against the Nazi ideology that had declared them inferior. But the Red Ball Express did more than sustain momentum, it reshaped the battlefield itself. At Metz, American artillery unleashed a bombardment that stunned German observers. 100,000 rounds in 24 hours. German analysts estimated that such a barrage should have required 50 truckloads of ammunition every hour. The Red Ball delivered it without pause, then supplied a 20% surplus. Meanwhile, German artillery units defending the same city were rationed to 50 rounds per gun per day. The imbalance was overwhelming, one side burning ammunition at industrial scale, the other scraping the bottom of empty depots. By mid-September, German intelligence believed the American system was beginning to collapse. Convoy spacing increased, truck speeds dipped, and drivers were visibly exhausted. It appeared, for a moment, that Patton would finally face the same paralysis that had crippled German offensives in Russia. But within 72 hours, the Americans adapted. They created intermediate transfer points that halved driver distances, reorganized routes, doubled vehicle assignments, and established forward maintenance hubs. By September 12th, the impossible had happened again. Daily tonnage increased. What should have been the breaking point became another surge of momentum. The lesson for German commanders was devastating. Their hopes of halting Patton along the Moselle or at the Siegfried Line depended on distance and delay. But distance had ceased to matter and delay had become impossible. The Red Ball Express had absorbed the worst the war could throw at it, and instead of slowing, it grew stronger. To American commanders watching the Red Ball Express in motion, the operation revealed a truth they had long understood, but never witnessed at such scale. In industrial war, logistics was not simply support, it was the decisive arm of strategy. Eisenhower himself visited the convoys in September 1944, standing beside roads lined with exhausted drivers who had been operating for 20 hours straight. Many were African American soldiers serving in a segregated army, forced to eat in separate facilities at home, yet entrusted with sustaining the most mobile fighting force on the continent. Observing them, Eisenhower remarked that these men were winning the war as surely as any infantry, a statement that would echo through post-war debates on military integration. To the American public, the Red Ball Express remained largely invisible during the war, overshadowed by the drama of infantry assaults and tank battles. But within the military, it triggered a reevaluation of long-held assumptions. The operation demonstrated that decentralized decision-making, mass production, and rapid improvisation could outperform rigid doctrine. Sergeants and lieutenants made choices that, in the Wehrmacht, required signatures from colonels. Supply depots appeared in fields overnight. Roads became arteries of national power. The United States discovered that its strength was not only in tanks or aircraft, but in the ability to mobilize an entire industrial society behind its armies. For the Germans, the Red Ball Express produced a strategic reckoning. Reports filtering into Berlin and East Prussia revealed an enemy operating at a tempo they could neither match nor disrupt. Luftwaffe units lacked the fuel and aircraft to threaten the convoys. Artillery bombardment proved useless against roads constantly repaired and routes constantly shifted. Field Marshal von Rundstedt famously concluded that the Americans had made distance irrelevant, erasing what had once been the most dependable constraint on mechanized warfare. Across Europe, the Red Ball Express reshaped civilian perceptions as well. French towns that had endured years of scarcity under German occupation now watched endless streams of American trucks carrying food, ammunition, and gasoline. Children lined the roads, receiving candy, soap, or rations from drivers who had little but still gave freely. The convoys became a symbol of abundance, a stark contrast to the austerity imposed by the occupying power. Reports from the German intelligence service noted that resistance activity surged wherever the Red Ball passed, fueled not by propaganda, but by the simple evidence that liberation came with resources, not ration cards. By the autumn of 1944, the world had witnessed something new, a demonstration that industrial democracy could outproduce, outsupply, and outlast a totalitarian regime that had defined itself by discipline and efficiency. The Red Ball Express was more than a logistical marvel. It was a statement of American capability that reshaped strategic thinking on both sides of the Atlantic. By the time the Red Ball Express shut down in November 1944, the roads of France bore the marks of a miracle that had lasted just 82 days. Ruts carved deep into the earth. Bridges hastily rebuilt. Abandoned trucks rusting in ditches like silent memorials to the men who refused to stop driving. The operation dissolved almost as quickly as it had appeared, but its impact remained etched not only into the landscape, but into the very shape of the Allied victory. In the months that followed, German officers studying their defeat reached a sobering conclusion. Their armies had not been broken solely by superior tactics or battlefield maneuvers. They had been overtaken by a nation that could turn factories, railroads, and city streets into instruments of war. In their final interrogations, many German generals spoke of the shock they felt watching American trucks pour across France in endless columns. "We prepared for your tanks," one of them admitted. "We never prepared for your trucks." For the United States, the legacy was larger than a single campaign. The Red Ball Express demonstrated that modern war belonged to the side that could deliver fuel, ammunition, rations, spare parts, men faster than any enemy could destroy them. It proved that logistics was not merely the backbone of strategy, but its beating heart. And it showed the world that industrial democracy, with all its imperfections and contradictions, could mobilize a force greater than the sum of its parts. The men who carried that legacy were the drivers themselves, 1,000 soldiers, many of them African American, who fought their war behind the wheel. They confronted exhaustion, danger, discrimination, and the cold indifference of history. Yet they kept driving, mile after mile, proving through action what had been denied to them in words, that courage, discipline, and excellence belonged to no single race. Their contribution helped lay the groundwork for a different America after the war, one that would eventually recognize the injustice of segregation and the power of those who had served under its shadow. Today, the lessons of the Red Ball Express still echo through every modern conflict. Logistics determines momentum. Momentum shapes strategy. And strategy decides the fate of nations. The convoys that roared across France at 35 miles per hour did more than keep Patton moving. They redefined what victory looked like in the industrial age. What about you? When you think back on this extraordinary operation, what stands out most, the scale, the sacrifice, or the surprising truth that trucks, not tanks, may have been the most decisive weapon of 1944? Share your thoughts below. And if you'd like to explore more stories where warfare, history, and human endurance collide, join us for the next chapter. In the frozen stillness of the Ardennes winter, long before the sun pushed its way through the fog, a single tank lay silent. Its steel frame, feared across continents, now breathed only the faint echo of a dying engine. For the men standing beside it, the silence said more than any report ever could. Something deeper than machinery had failed. Something fundamental. Most stories of war begin with the clash of armies. This one begins with the question whispered in the dark. How does a force built on iron, discipline, and ambition come to a halt not by enemy fire, but by the emptiness of a fuel gauge? The answer was not lying on a battlefield. It was stacked quietly in an abandoned American depot where rows of untouched gasoline cans gleamed in the dawn like a revelation. That morning, as German troops crowded around 50,000 gallons of American fuel, a realization colder than the December wind settled over their commander. Victory would not be decided by courage or tactics. It would be decided by what fed the engines of war. And the Americans had oceans. Germany had drops. Modern wars rarely collapse in a single moment. They unravel quietly through shortages, delays, and decisions made months before the first shot is fired. By the summer of 1944, the German war machine was already bleeding from within. Allied bombers had reduced synthetic fuel plants to twisted metal, cutting production by more than 90%. What flowed from the Reich's refineries no longer matched the demands of a mechanized army stretched across continents. Commanders rationed gasoline by the liter. Aircraft sat grounded. Veteran tank crews trained on maps instead of engines. Yet Adolf Hitler envisioned one last reversal of fate, a massive winter offensive through the Ardennes. Its purpose was brutally simple: break the American front, seize Antwerp, and split the Allied coalition. But hidden beneath the boldness was a truth that only his logisticians dared whisper. The assault had no hope unless German forces captured American fuel along the way. For Joachim Peiper and his Kampfgruppe, this reality defined every choice before the battle even began. Peiper's armored spearhead, designated the Schwerpunkt of the offensive, received just 31,000 gallons of fuel, barely enough for 50 miles of combat operations. The Meuse River, their essential objective, lay 65 miles away. The mathematics were merciless. Success depended not on maneuver, but on seizing depots the Americans might abandon. When Peiper attended the final briefing on December 14th, his orders reflected this desperation. Tanks would move in single file to conserve fuel. Engines were to be shut down during every halt longer than 5 minutes. Capturing American supplies was not merely encouraged, it superseded all tactical priorities. Victory required gasoline before territory. Even ammunition was secondary. At dawn on December 16th, the German offensive erupted with an artillery barrage powerful enough to recall the early triumphs of the Blitzkrieg. But the veneer of strength masked the fragility beneath. Panzer columns quickly bogged down on narrow country roads that German maps had misrepresented as highways. Vehicles designed for the open Russian steppes groaned through muddy forest paths. Congestion grew for miles. Engines idled longer than intended, and precious gallons evaporated into the cold air. Then came Lanzerath. 18 American reconnaissance soldiers, barely more than a squad, held off Peiper's advancing column for nearly 10 hours. Their resistance forced dozens of German tanks and half-tracks to idle in place, consuming the very resource the offensive could not spare. By the time the bottleneck cleared, Kampfgruppe Peiper had already burned almost half of its allocated fuel. When the column finally reached the outskirts of Hansfeld in the pre-dawn hours of December 17th, the realization struck with brutal clarity. After barely 20 miles of progress, Peiper's tanks were already running dry. The campaign meant to rescue the Reich had become a race against its own empty fuel lines. That was the moment they discovered the American depot. The captured fuel at Hansfeld did more than bring Peiper's column back to life. For a brief moment, it revived the illusion that the offensive could still succeed. His crews worked feverishly in the bitter wind, pouring American gasoline into German tanks as if each gallon were a lifeline. Engines rumbled back to life. Tracks bit into the frozen earth. Every man felt the fragile momentum returning. But as Kampfgruppe Peiper pushed deeper into Belgium, the nature of the war began to reveal itself. The first signs came in the form of documents. Among the abandoned American offices at Hansfeld, a German sergeant found shipping manifest ordinary papers that told an extraordinary story. The fuel Peiper had just captured had crossed an entire world, from Texas to New York, from New York to Liverpool, from Liverpool across the Channel, and then hundreds of miles by truck to the front. 6,000 miles in 6 weeks. What Germany guarded with divisions, the United States delivered with routine efficiency. The deeper the column advanced, the sharper the contrast became. At Billingen, they seized more fuel, maps, rations, and ammunition. Yet the maps showed something unsettling. American depots were everywhere. At crossroads, behind ridgelines, near villages and rail stations. The first Army alone held millions of gallons in reserve. For the Germans, fuel was treasure. For the Americans, it was simply inventory. Still, the offensive pressed on. Tigers and Panthers rolled forward, consuming fuel at brutal rates to 5 gallons per mile for the Tigers, 1.5 for the Panthers. The rugged Ardennes terrain increased those numbers by nearly 40%. Each mile was bought with gasoline the Germans did not have. Then came the moment that shattered even the hardiest illusions. As Piper's vanguard approached the vast American depot at Stavelot-over, 2 million gallons stacked across 15 acres, they expected another miraculous windfall. Instead, they found American engineers already at work. Under orders to deny the fuel at all costs, the men of the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion laid trails of gasoline between the stacks of jerry cans. White phosphorus grenades were distributed. One spark changed everything. A wall of fire shot into the sky, a roaring column of flame and smoke that could be seen for miles. The inferno consumed the fuel in hours, but its meaning burned far longer. The Americans could afford to destroy more gasoline in an afternoon than the Germans had received for the entire offensive. As the flames reached 1,000 feet, Piper's men understood what the numbers had been trying to tell them for months. The enemy possessed abundance beyond comprehension, and the contrast only grew sharper. The Red Ball Express 6,000 trucks running night and day delivered more fuel in a single week than Piper's entire army group would see in a month. Pipelines laid under the English Channel pumped 1 million gallons a day into France. Standardized American vehicles burned fuel efficiently, carried interchangeable parts, and were replaced faster than Germany could repair its own. The summit of the offensive had been reached, but it was not marked by triumph. It was marked by the realization that the German advance was climbing a mountain made of numbers they could never overcome. By December 19th, the illusion of momentum had collapsed. Kampfgruppe Piper was still fighting, still maneuvering, still pushing toward the Meuse, but the fuel gauges told a harsher truth. Each engagement burned more than the column could capture. Each mile forward was borrowed time. Reports from maintenance units grew more desperate. Panthers abandoning the march because their tanks ran dry. Tigers left behind on roadsides like gutted monuments to a fading ambition. At Stoumont, the weight of the crisis became undeniable. German crews fought fiercely, but every maneuver cost gallons they could never replace. Piper consolidated what remained, perhaps 8,000 gallons in total, barely enough for one final attack or a retreat, but not both. He chose to press on, knowing that strategy had long since given way to survival. Meanwhile, the Americans were preparing for January operations with a scale of planning unimaginable to their opponents. Brigadier General Morris Gillen requested 245 million gallons for the coming month. The request was approved without debate. On the same day, C-47 transports flew hundreds of sorties into the besieged town of Bastogne, delivering more fuel to a single surrounded garrison than Piper's entire formation possessed at its peak. Clear skies on December 23rd sealed the German fate. Allied aircraft took to the air P-47s, B-26s, and fighter bombers, each burning fuel by the hundreds of gallons every hour. One day of air operations consumed more gasoline than Germany had allocated for its entire winter offensive. Bombs fell on roads, bridges, and supply lines, turning the German advance into a patchwork of isolated pockets. That night, Piper faced a decision that no commander wants to make. With the encirclement tightening around L'Église, the last drops of fuel were pulled into a handful of vehicles. The remaining tanks, half-tracks, and trucks machines worth fortunes in steel and manpower were drained dry. Crews smashed radios, set demolition charges, and prepared to abandon the armored beasts they had spent years mastering. The next hours unfolded in a quiet more haunting than battle. Men who had once charged across continents now slipped through forests on foot, carrying only what they could. Behind them, 39 tanks, 70 half-tracks, and 177 vehicles sat waiting for destruction. When the explosions came, they lit the night with brief bursts of orange final markers of a force that had moved 60 miles, captured depots, shattered towns, and yet had been defeated not by an enemy maneuver, but by the simplest arithmetic of war. Of the 5,000 men who began the operation with Kampfgruppe Piper, roughly 770 would return. The Ardennes had taken its toll in lives and steel, but its most devastating blow was conceptual. The battle revealed with unflinching clarity the boundary between courage and capability. German troops had fought with determination. Their tanks had proven formidable. Their commanders had been experienced. But none of that mattered once the fuel was gone. For the first time, it became undeniable. Modern war was no longer a contest of will. It was a contest of supply. From the American perspective, the Battle of the Bulge was not merely a test of courage. It was a test of a logistical system built across oceans, continents, and industrial landscapes. While German commanders rationed fuel by the liter, American planners discussed gasoline in millions of gallons numbers so large that their adversaries could scarcely comprehend them. Within you. Headquarters, officers monitored supply flows with clinical precision. Colonel James Snyder recorded daily fuel receipts and expenditures, noting net gains even during heavy combat. To the Americans, fuel was not a luxury. It was an expectation produced in quantities unmatched by any other nation on earth. The East Texas oil fields alone pumped more petroleum than all of German-occupied Europe combined. This abundance shaped world opinion. Observers across Allied nations saw the Ardennes as proof that industrial democracy could outproduce authoritarian militarism. Britain, still recovering from years of rationing and bombings, marveled at the endless convoys rolling off American ships. The Soviet Union understood the message as well. Behind every American soldier stood a vast engine of factories, refineries, pipelines, and workers whose output seemed inexhaustible. At a strategic level, American doctrine emphasized mobility above all. Tanks, trucks, and aircraft were built around standardization, parts interchangeable, maintenance simplified, fuel consumption efficient. A Sherman tank burned roughly a third of the gasoline required by a Tiger. Trucks averaged 8 miles per gallon under load, and when one broke, it was often faster to replace the entire vehicle than to repair it. To the Americans, destroying millions of gallons at Stavelot was not an act of desperation. It was an act of confidence. They could afford it. World leaders understood the implications. After the war at Nuremberg, German generals repeatedly cited logistics, not courage, not tactical failure, as the decisive factor of 1944. They acknowledged that the United States had rewritten the nature of modern warfare. Battles would be determined less by generals in the field and more by supply officers, engineers, and industrial workers thousands of miles from the front. The world had stepped into a new era. Logistics was no longer the hidden backbone of war. It was the war. Today, the Tiger tank that once led Kampfgruppe Piper stands silent in a small museum at La Glaise. Its armor is intact. Its gun is intact. Even its tracks, though weathered by decades, still rest exactly where the crew abandoned them. Only the fuel gauge tells the real story. It sits frozen at empty a quiet monument to the moment when tactical brilliance met logistical reality and lost. Visitors often ask why such a formidable machine was left behind. The answer is not found in the scars of battle, but in the invisible threads of supply lines stretching across nations. That December, Germany lost, not because its soldiers fought poorly or because its tanks were inferior. It lost because its engines were starved while American engines were fed by an industrial system vast enough to circle the globe. The legacy of Hansfeld and Stavelot reaches far beyond the Ardennes. It marked the end of the romantic myth that wars are won solely by bravery, bold maneuvers, or the genius of generals. The truth was harder, colder, and more enduring. Modern warfare is a contest of production, fuel, transportation, and the relentless capacity to sustain movement. Courage matters. Skill matters. But without supply, they evaporate like heat on winter steel. Joachim Peiper understood this long before historians put it into words. When he stood among 50,000 gallons of captured American fuel, he glimpsed an uncomfortable reality. What seemed miraculous to him was insignificant to the enemy. What his army needed to survive, the Americans could burn without hesitation. That knowledge was more decisive than any artillery barrage or armored breakthrough. And so the Ardennes became more than a battlefield. It became a lesson. A cautionary reminder that nations rise and fall not only on the strength of their armies, but on the strength of their foundations, the factories, the refineries, the workers who never see the front but shape its outcome all the same. As you reflect on this chapter of history, consider a question that echoes across decades. In a world where technology and supply lines grow ever more complex, can any nation win a modern war without mastering the logistics behind it? If stories like this help you appreciate the hidden forces that shape our world, feel free to share your thoughts below and join us for the next journey into the depths of military history. On the morning haze of North Africa, where dust drifted like a veil over the broken ridgelines near Kasserine Pass, 5 Sherman tanks moved with a clarity that defied the battlefield itself. Their crews could not see one another. The terrain splintered their sight lines. The smoke of artillery blurred every horizon. Yet the American formation advanced as if bound by an invisible thread, turning, accelerating, and converging with a precision no German commander believed possible without flags, flares, or shouted commands. For the soldiers watching from panzer turrets, the moment felt unsettling, almost unreal. How could these American tanks maneuver with such unity when doctrine said they should have been blind? Where did this instinctive coordination come from? The answer did not lie in armor thickness, firepower, or any visible advantage. It lived in the quiet hum of unseen waves, radiating from within every Sherman, binding their crews into something larger than any individual machine. And so the question hangs over that dusty morning. In a war defined by steel and fire, could the most decisive weapon be something the enemy could not see at all? Long before those Shermans rolled through the dust of North Africa, the foundations of their advantage were quietly being built in workshops thousands of miles away. In 1941, as German armored divisions surged across the Soviet frontier with the confidence of seasoned veterans, American engineers were wrestling with a different question. What if victory in armored warfare would belong not to the tank with the thickest armor, but to the army that could speak the clearest? The United States had entered a period of rapid military transformation. Its armored forces were still young, its doctrine still forming, but its industrial and scientific potential was vast. Within the Signal Corps and inside the Galvin Manufacturing Laboratories, soon to be known as Motorola, a group of engineers began shaping what would become one of the most important shifts in the history of mechanized war. Daniel E. Noble championed the leap toward frequency modulation, a technology that promised clarity in the chaos of battle. Henryk Magnuski solved the brutal engineering challenge of installing sensitive electronics inside a metal machine that shook like an earthquake and roared like a factory. Their creation, the SCR-508, was not merely a radio. It was a new way of thinking about warfare. At 181 pounds, the system added no firepower, no armor, no speed. Yet it turned an ordinary medium tank into a connected instrument of coordinated action. 10 preset channels, crystal-controlled stability, and a transmitter powerful enough to cut through engine noise and desert heat, all of it woven into a battlefield where the German Panzer Force still relied on amplitude-modulated sets designed before the world understood what modern armored warfare would require. Germany had pioneered the idea of radio-enabled armored tactics in the 1930s, but by the early years of the war, its production simply could not keep pace with its expanding front lines. Many Panzer IVs carried only receivers. Even fewer mounted the full Fuchs 5 transceiver. Command tanks, marked by extra antennae, became obvious targets. Once destroyed, entire platoons fell silent. Orders could be heard but not answered. Threats could be seen but not reported. Across the desert, across the mountains, across the fields of Europe, German armor often fought as isolated machines rather than a unified force. This imbalance shaped the earliest American battles of the war. When the first armored units landed during Operation Torch in November 1942, their crews were still inexperienced, their tactics untested, their confidence unsteady. But the radios inside their tanks delivered something priceless, the ability to stay connected even as the battlefield collapsed around them. It was a capability the Germans did not expect and were not prepared to counter. The stage was set. The Americans were not yet skilled, nor were their tanks superior. But they carried a weapon no one could see, one that would redefine every engagement that followed. The true test of America's new communication advantage emerged not in laboratories or training grounds, but in the chaos of Tunisia. At Kasserine Pass in February 1943, armored forces, still green, still learning the brutal arithmetic of war, found themselves scattered across 50 miles of broken terrain. Units that had never fought together, crews that did not know each other's names, suddenly depended on the same fragile lifeline, the clear, unwavering voice carried through SCR 508 radios. Even in retreat, the radios held their ground. Tank commanders relayed enemy movements, requested artillery fire, and warned isolated platoons of German thrusts. What should have been a complete collapse instead became a lesson, brutal, costly, but invaluable in the power of staying connected. German intercept teams listened in disbelief. How could American units maintain coordination at ranges where German Fuchs 5 sets produced only static? The pattern grew sharper in Italy. The steep ridgelines and winding valleys of the Apennines should have favored German doctrine. Visual communication was impossible. Signals disappeared behind stone and forest, and even experienced radio operators struggled with reflections that distorted amplitude-modulated transmissions. Yet the American FM sets thrived in these conditions. Sherman platoons, separated by mountains, maneuvered as if on level ground, calling out enemy gun positions and synchronizing movement through terrain that reduced German radios to silence. What should have been an equalizer became an amplifier of American strength. Then came Normandy. On June 6, 1944, as Shermans rolled off landing craft into the churned waters off Omaha Beach, their radios linked them instantly to naval fire support and to command ships far offshore. No German armored formation possessed anything comparable. But in the hedgerows of Normandy, a new problem emerged. American infantry equipped with SCR 300 radios on different frequency bands could not warn Sherman crews of Panzerfaust ambushes hidden behind living walls of earth and vegetation. For a moment, the advantage fractured. The solution arrived from the front lines themselves. Crews welded ammunition boxes to their tanks and mounted EE-8 field telephones inside them, wired directly to the intercom. With a single adaptation born of necessity, American tanks and infantry became a unified force again. By the time Operation Cobra began in late July, the communication gap had vanished. Cobra revealed the full extent of what clear universal radio communication could do. The 2nd Armored Division moved more than 200 Shermans through smoke, dust, and shattered road networks with a speed and precision that stunned the German Panzer Division. Artillery strikes arrived minutes after identification. Threats spotted miles away triggered immediate counteraction. To German crews fighting with failing radios and collapsing lines of communication, the Americans did not merely seem coordinated, they seemed omnipresent. And from that point forward, the battlefield belonged to the side that could speak, listen, and respond faster than the enemy could understand. By late 1944, the true weight of America's communication advantage began shaping not just individual clashes, but the fate of entire campaigns. Nowhere was this clearer than in the fields around Aricourt, where the 4th Armored Division confronted multiple German panzer brigades equipped with the formidable Panther tanks superior in armor, optics, and firepower. On paper, the matchup bordered on hopeless. In battle, it became something else entirely. Every Sherman in the 4th Armored Division, no matter how outgunned, could report enemy movement the moment it appeared. Tank destroyer units received targeting information from Shermans positioned miles away, enabling them to strike first. Artillery observers riding in command tanks wired to the same radio net called down barrages within minutes. The Panthers, powerful as they were, fought in isolation. Their communications faltered with every burst of engine noise, every shift in terrain, every disruption of command vehicles. The result was a 3-week contest in which the 4th Armored Division destroyed 281 German armored vehicles while losing only 41 Sherman to kill ratio that contradicted every expectation of raw mechanical superiority. The consequences stretched far beyond the battlefield. German commanders began to realize that their tactical assumptions, particularly the belief that destroying command tanks would paralyze American units, were catastrophically flawed. They continued to aim for vehicles with multiple antennas, not understanding that every Sherman in the formation was a command tank in all but name. This miscalculation repeated itself across France and into the German heartland, where destroyed panzer formations often left behind radios drifting off frequency or failing under electrical interference. Then came the shock at Remagen in March 1945. When the Ludendorff Bridge was found intact, a single radio report from the 9th Armored Division rippled outward in minutes. Entire divisions shifted, artillery repositioned, logistics rerouted. Within an hour, yet American forces were moving to exploit an opportunity that should have vanished before they could reach it. German units, reliant on damaged telephone lines and AM sets crippled by interference, responded with delays measured not in minutes, but in hours. Their counterattacks arrived piecemeal, uncoordinated, and were destroyed one by one. The final collapse unfolded in the rear pocket. As American armored columns executed a double envelopment coordinated entirely through radio networks, more than 300,000 German troops found themselves trapped. Inside the pocket, German communications disintegrated. Field Marshal Walter Models. Final messages fragmented. Desperate spoke of units cut off from headquarters, regiments unable to communicate with each other, commanders fighting blind. The human dimension of this disparity was profound. American tank crews entered battle knowing they were never truly alone. Even in smoke, even in darkness, a voice from another Sherman could reach them. German crews, on the other hand, often fought their battles as isolated duels, Panthers and Panzer IVs reduced to individual survivors in a war defined by coordination. In those final months of the war, the lesson became unmistakable. Even the strongest armor fractures when it cannot speak, cannot hear, and cannot act as part of something larger than itself. In the aftermath of these decisive campaigns, a broader truth emerged on that reached far beyond tank duels or battlefield maneuvers. The American triumph in armored warfare was not simply the result of better industry, larger armies, or favorable logistics. It reflected a philosophical shift, the belief that information, not armor, would govern the future of war. To American strategists, the SCR-508 was more than an accessory. It was the foundation of a flexible combat command structure that allowed units to form, dissolve, and reform into mission-specific task forces. This adaptability baffled German officers accustomed to rigid organization, where communication scarcity forced hierarchy rather than encouraged creativity. By contrast, American commanders could combine infantry, armor, artillery, and reconnaissance units with confidence that they would remain in seamless contact. Other nations took notice. After the war, Soviet engineers studying captured German and American equipment reached a stark conclusion. Germany had built superior tanks, but America had built superior systems. The Red Army, recognizing the limitations of its wartime communications, where a majority of T-34s fought without radio shows to emulate American designs for its post-war armored doctrine. Soviet field manuals echoed lessons drawn from Sherman formations. Without universal radio deployment, massed armor becomes a liability rather than an asset. In West Germany, the newly formed Bundeswehr confronted the past with unusual clarity. Training manuals emphasized that German defeat often stemmed not from inferior vehicles, but from inferior communication. Every Leopard tank manufactured carried advanced radio capabilities, reflecting a doctrine shaped directly by the failures of the Fudge Five. In time, NATO as a whole adopted the same principle, advancing toward a vision of warfare where instant information exchange was the central combat multiplier. Modern conflicts only reinforced these lessons. In the Gulf War of 1991, American and coalition forces, wielding sophisticated digital networks, overwhelmed Iraqi units equipped with individually formidable Soviet-designed tanks but crippled by outdated radios. In 2003, the same pattern reappeared, fast-moving, highly connected U. Formations outpaced opponents whose armored vehicles still relied on limited, inconsistent communications. Across decades and continents, the verdict remained consistent. The victories achieved by Sherman crews in 1943 and 1944 were not accidents of history. They were the first clear demonstration that network-centric warfare triumphs over platform-centric warfare. A tank's gun might decide a duel, but its ability to communicate decides a campaign. In the final months of World War II, as the smoke settled over ruined cities and armored columns rolled to a halt along the Rhine and the Elbe, something deeper than victory or defeat came into focus. The war had revealed a truth long hidden beneath the clash of steel and fire, that on a modern battlefield, the most decisive advantage is not always visible. It does not roar like an engine or strike like a shell. Sometimes it moves quietly, carried on a wavelength, traveling from one crew to another, binding individual soldiers into a force greater than themselves. For the Sherman crews, the SCR-508 was more than a piece of equipment bolted inside the hull. It was the reason they never felt abandoned in the fog of war. A tank immobilized by mud was not lost. A platoon cut off by smoke was not silent. A commander thrown into chaos could still hear the steady voice of another crew miles away. That connection created a kind of battlefield resilience the Germans could not match, no matter how thick their armor or how powerful their guns. For the German crews, the contrast was painful. Many fought with unmatched skill and bravery, yet they entered each engagement knowing that if their commander fell or their radio faltered, they would face the enemy alone. Isolation defined their war as much as any tactical decision. In memoirs written long after the fighting ended, German tank veterans recalled not just the shock of American coordination, but the loneliness that shaped their final battles. The legacy of these encounters reaches far beyond the 1940s. Modern armored warfare, from the deserts of Kuwait to the streets of Baghdad, still reflects the lesson first proven by the Sherman that information dominance outweighs platform superiority. Today's networked battlefields trace their lineage directly to those early FM radios humming inside steel hulls crossing North Africa. And so the question lingers for us decades later, if the invisible advantage of communication could reshape an entire war, what does that mean for the conflicts of our own time? For those who study history, for veterans who carried these lessons forward, and for anyone who believes that understanding the past helps safeguard the future, the story of the Sherman's radio is more than a technical footnote. It is a reminder that wars are not only won by strength, but by connection, by the ability to act together when everything else threatens to tear units apart. If this story speaks to you, share your thoughts. What do you believe is the greatest lesson modern warfare inherited from the battlefields of World War II? On a humid Tennessee morning in the summer of 1943, a German soldier stood beneath the shadow of a wooden barrack, turning a glass bottle slowly in his hands. Inside it, a dark liquid fizzed and shimmered in the light. He had crossed deserts, survived hunger, and marched under the banner of an empire that promised triumph. Yet nothing on the battlefields of North Africa had prepared him for the quiet shock of tasting a Coca-Cola. To him, that sweetness bordered on the unreal, a luxury that war was not supposed to allow. Only weeks earlier, he had fought in a world defined by scarcity. Hard biscuits passed for breakfast. Ersatz coffee kept men awake through sandstorms. Food was strategy, and hunger was a constant companion. But here, behind the fences of an American prison camp, he found shelves stocked with candy bars and ice cream sold for the price of a nickel. Everything he had been taught about American weakness began to unravel with each sip. And so a question emerged, one far more powerful than any weapon on the battlefield. What happens when a man raised on sacrifice confronts a nation built on abundance? They had come from a very different war. In May 1943, as the Africa Corps collapsed in Tunisia, nearly 250,000 German and Italian soldiers laid down their weapons before the advancing Allied forces. Many of them were veterans of the desert campaigns, hardened by months of deprivation and unbroken heat. They had marched beneath Rommel's banner, pushed the British across Libya, and lived through a war fought on sand and supply lines. Yet, even as they surrendered, they carried with them the grim certainty that capture meant suffering. Nazi propaganda had warned them that Americans starved their prisoners, that captivity in the United States would be a slow death by neglect. Their first hours in Allied custody shattered that belief. Instead of punishment, the men received American K rations. These small khaki-colored boxes, the same ones U.S. soldiers often complained about, were revelations. Crackers that did not crumble to dust, processed cheese that tasted impossibly rich, candy bars wrapped in bright foil, instant coffee with real sugar tablets. For men who had spent months counting calories, this was not a meal, but a feast. It marked the beginning of an education they did not expect. As the prisoners were processed through temporary camps in North Africa, the surprises multiplied. Military records describe breakfasts of pancakes, syrup, eggs, and milk served to enemy soldiers. Foods that had vanished from German rations years earlier appeared here without ceremony, offered to defeated opponents. The contrast was unmistakable. The Americans were feeding prisoners better than the German army fed its own men in the field. When the Liberty ships arrived to transport them across the Atlantic, the lesson grew sharper. These vessels, mass-produced at unprecedented speed, embodied a scale of industry the prisoners had never imagined. One new ship every 42 hours. Holds packed with supplies. Refrigeration systems running day and night. And aboard them, the German captives received rations equal to or greater than the crew's. Fresh bread, meat, vegetables, and coffee served with milk, a luxury most Germans had not tasted since before the war. But nothing challenged their assumptions more than the ice cream. Several ships reported serving it during the Atlantic crossings. 10-gallon batches, churned in steel machines, offered to prisoners as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world. To men who had last seen ice cream in their childhoods, this single detail was almost incomprehensible. On the open ocean in the middle of a global war, their captors gave them a dessert that Germany could not reliably provide even in peacetime. By the time the ships approached Norfolk or Newport News, many prisoners no longer feared what awaited them in America. Instead, they stared out at the coastline with a dawning realization. They were entering a nation whose strength did not lie only in weapons or armies, but in something far more disorienting, a capacity for abundance so great that even its enemies would experience it from the moment they surrendered. What awaited the prisoners on American soil was not a single revelation, but a series of shocks, each more disorienting than the last. Their first steps into Norfolk Naval Base offered a sweeping view of a country whose industrial rhythm seemed to pulse beneath every steel crane and storage yards. The base covered more acreage than many German cities, and the volume of cargo moving through it each day surpassed what major German ports managed in an entire week. For the men who had marched across the deserts of Tunisia, this was not merely infrastructure. It was evidence that the war they thought they understood had been fought on uneven ground from the very beginning. In the port exchanges, they encountered another surprise: rows of candy bars, stacked freely on shelves. Hershey, Mars, Nestle, names they barely recognized but would never forget. Each bar cost 5 cents, the same price paid by American children. The idea that sweets were so common that even dock workers bought them casually contradicted every story they had been told about American decadence and instability. Here, abundance was not a privilege. It was routine. Their journey inland reinforced the lesson. Instead of cramped cattle cars, prisoners traveled in passenger coaches. Dining cars served full meals. Fried chicken, vegetables, pie, and coffee poured freely from silver pots. What astonished them was not the quality of the food, but the realization that they were not receiving special treatment. These were standard meals served to any civilian traveling across the country. In Germany, such service had been restricted to officers and elites. In America, it was simply how trains operated. Then there were the prison camps themselves. Camp Crossville in Tennessee, Camp Hearn in Texas, Camp Shelby in Mississippi, each one built with electric lighting, heated barracks, hot water, and flush toilets. The Geneva Convention required humane treatment, but the Americans went far beyond that baseline. Barracks were insulated against the winter. Medical staff conducted regular checkups. And in the camp exchanges, prisoners found something that would become a symbol of their ideological undoing: Coca-Cola. For 5 cents, the same price as candy bars, a man could purchase a bottle of the fizzy drink he had first encountered with disbelief. American guards explained that children bought it daily with pocket money. Work details saw vending machines in factories, gas stations, schools, places where Germans would never expect to find luxuries. The scale was staggering. Many camps received hundreds of cases each week, delivered with clockwork regularity. Technically minded prisoners marveled at how every bottle tasted identical, whether in Maine or Texas, proof of a standardization they had believed German industry excelled at. And then came the summer celebrations. At Camp Shelby, men gathered to watch hand-cranked ice cream makers turn ice and salt and cream into gallons of frozen dessert for Independence Day. The simplicity of the ingredients made the result no less bewildering. Germany rationed sugar to civilians by the gram. In America, the kitchen staff discarded hardened sugar by the sack and simply ordered more. For the prisoners, this was the turning point. Not the ice cream itself, but what it represented. A society so wealthy, so confident in its productive power, that it could share luxuries with enemies in the middle of a global war. In those moments, many of them realized they were witnessing more than hospitality. They were witnessing the full force of American industrial might, expressed not through weapons, but through everyday life. By 1944, the German prisoners no longer needed lectures or pamphlets to understand the imbalance between the two nations. They could see it with their own eyes. Assigned to labor details across the American heartland, they worked in orchards, canneries, and sugar beet fields. What they witnessed there was more than efficiency. It was a scale of production that their homeland, still clinging to ration books and shortages, simply could not match. In Michigan, they harvested cherries destined not for survival rations, but for maraschino garnishes placed atop ice cream sundaes. Tons of fruit grown for decoration left many speechless. At the Del Monte canneries, they watched workers reject perfectly edible peaches in pairs because they were too small or uneven in color. Back home, those same fruits would have been treasured, not discarded. Records from 1944 show that 15% of fruit was rejected for cosmetic reasons alone, much of it sent to animal feed. The prisoners could only stare. This was not wastefulness for its own sake. It was a system so confident in abundance that it demanded perfection from its products. Sugar beet fields in Colorado and Nebraska revealed a similar truth. Single farms produced more sugar than entire German regions. Mechanized harvesters cut, lifted, and loaded beets with a speed that surpassed anything in European agriculture. For the prisoners, many of whom came from farming families, the message was unmistakable. A nation that could produce such quantities of sugar could also produce the weapons, fuel, and machinery needed to sustain a global war. Abundance was not indulgence. It was the foundation of American power. And then came the numbers gold, undeniable, printed openly in American newspapers. 7 million tons of sugar, 5 billion bottles of Coca-Cola, 500 million gallons of ice cream, military chocolate procurement running into hundreds of millions of pounds. The United States produced more food, more sugar, more dairy, and more consumer goods while fighting a global war than Germany had managed in peacetime. Every figure confirmed what the prisoners had already sensed. Their defeat had been sealed long before they set foot in Tunisia. The reversal in 1944 and 1945 made the truth even sharper. German prisoners began sending food parcels to their families, using camp wages to buy chocolate bars, canned meat, instant coffee, and other goods. The International Red Cross recorded more than 11 million parcels shipped from prisoners in America to civilians in Germany, an inversion so profound that many families wept when they opened the packages. Their sons, held in enemy captivity, were eating better than they were in freedom. By the time the war ended, the physical evidence spoke for itself. Many prisoners returned to Germany heavier and healthier than when they had been captured. Their families, weakened by years of deprivation, could not reconcile this with the propaganda they had been fed. The contrast was too great. It rendered the old ideology hollow. And for the prisoners themselves, the transformation was irreversible. They had entered captivity believing in German superiority. They returned home knowing that the true measure of power was not domination, but the ability to create so much abundance that even enemies could share in it. To American planners, the treatment of German prisoners was never simply an act of generosity. It reflected a deeper strategic conviction about the nature of power in a democracy. The United States understood that its greatest strength was not only its army or its factories, but its ability to produce enough for everyone. Abundance, in the American view, was not a luxury, it was a stabilizing force. If citizens, soldiers, and even prisoners could be fed well, morale would remain strong and resentment would not take root. Scarcity bred extremism. Plenty discouraged it. Within the War Department, this philosophy shaped policy. Commanders believed that treating prisoners humanely would reaffirm the moral purpose of American soldiers, many of whom came from farms, factories, and towns that valued fairness even in conflict. It also aligned with Geneva Convention obligations, but in practice went far beyond them. Feeding prisoners generously was a way of demonstrating the confidence of a nation that did not fear its enemies because it knew it could outproduce them. International observers noted the contrast. While Germany rationed sugar to its civilians in tiny monthly allowances, American camps placed bowls of sugar on mess hall tables without restriction. Foreign diplomats visiting the United States during the war often remarked that the country seemed to operate on a different economic plane, capable of supplying both a global army and a vast home front while still maintaining consumer markets. In this sense, the treatment of POWs served as a living exhibit of the American system. It showed that democratic capitalism could generate not only weapons, but well-being. The long-term effects on Germany were profound. When the war ended, hundreds of thousands of former prisoners returned home with first-hand knowledge of how the American economy functioned. They had seen mechanized agriculture, standardized factories, and distribution networks that moved goods across thousands of miles with astonishing consistency. More importantly, they had experienced the social consequences of abundance, where class mattered less, where opportunity seemed wider, and where even the smallest town displayed a level of material comfort unimaginable in wartime Europe. These men would become unexpected advocates for partnership with the United States. Their testimonials softened political resistance to the Marshall Plan and helped German citizens understand that American aid was not exploitation, but extension and offer to rebuild a society on principles that had already proven their strength. In many ways, the seeds of West Germany's post-war economic miracle were planted not in boardrooms or ministries, but in the mess halls and PX stores of American prison camps. In the years that followed the war, the memories carried home by former German prisoners became more than personal stories. They became quiet testimonies to a different understanding of power. Many of these men returned to a homeland reduced to rubble, its cities darkened and its people worn thin by hunger. Yet, in their minds lingered the taste of something almost unbelievable. Ice cream served on a hot American afternoon, a cold bottle of Coca-Cola opened without ceremony, a chocolate bar that arrived not as a reward, but as an ordinary part of daily life. These fragments of memory stood in stark contrast to the bleakness that greeted them at home. For their families, the stories sounded impossible. How could a nation at war fighting across oceans, supplying armies on multiple continents, offer such generosity to its enemies? But as West Germany slowly rebuilt, the truth of what the prisoners had witnessed became clearer. America's great strength had never been its ability to conquer. It had been its capacity to create, to produce, to distribute. A society that could hand ice cream to prisoners during a global conflict had discovered a form of power that went beyond strategy or ideology. It was the power of abundance, shared without fear. Over time, the symbolic items of their captivity became part of Germany's new cultural landscape. Coca-Cola returned in 1949, followed by soda fountains, ice cream parlors, and eventually supermarkets modeled on the American style. These were not mere consumer goods. They were reminders of a revelation, that prosperity could be democratic, that luxuries could be common, and that dignity came not from domination, but from opportunity. Historians would later argue that this transformation, rooted in everyday experiences rather than political directives, was among the most effective reorientations of a defeated nation in modern history. The men who had once marched under the banner of the Third Reich became witnesses to a different kind of world, one where power was measured not by scarcity, but by the ability to provide. And so their story leaves us with a question that echoes far beyond the barracks and prison fences of the 1940s. In a world still shaped by conflict and ideology, can abundance, fairness, and simple human generosity remain forces strong enough to challenge extremism? If you have your own reflections on this chapter of history, its lessons, its contradictions, or its echoes in the present, I invite you to share them below. And if you value these journeys into the past, consider joining us as we explore the battles, decisions, and turning points that continue to shape our world. The room was thick with cigarette smoke, the kind that clung to uniforms and drifted through the corridors of power. A single window looked out onto a city preparing for war, but inside the Reich Air Ministry, a man in a white uniform laughed as he tossed an intelligence report onto the polished table. In that moment, Hermann Goering believed he understood the limits of American industry, and he believed those limits were fixed. A nation of consumers, he thought, could never become a nation of warriors. But beyond the Atlantic, in a place where factory whistles marked the rhythm of ordinary life, something far greater was beginning to stir. Workshops were being cleared, blueprints redrawn, and workers who had never seen an aircraft up close were preparing to build the machines that would decide the future of the world. No one outside a handful of engineers understood the scale of what was coming. It raises a question that echoes across history. What happens when a dictatorship mistakes silence for weakness or underestimates a democracy that has not yet begun to fight? The answer would be written not on battlefields, but on assembly lines. Factories across the American landscape still carried the quiet hum of peacetime industry when the world around them began to fall apart. In Europe, armored columns carved through France with alarming speed. Radios crackled with urgent reports. Governments collapsed in weeks. And across the Atlantic, the United States watched a continent burn while its own military remained painfully unprepared for a global conflict. In 1939, America possessed only a modest Air Corps, a force with 1,700 combat aircraft, many of them relics of the previous decade. On paper, the nation that dreamed of freedom had little ability to defend it. Yet, within this vulnerability lay the ignition point of one of the greatest transformations in human history. When Franklin Roosevelt stood before Congress on May 16, 1940, he did not speak like a man constrained by the present. He spoke like someone who understood what the future demanded. His declaration was stark. America, he insisted, must acquire the ability to produce 50,000 airplanes a year. Few believed such a number could ever be achieved. Allies doubted. Opponents scoffed. Even within Washington, the goal seemed untethered from reality. But the president already knew the man he intended to rely upon. William Knudsen, a Danish immigrant who had risen to the presidency of General Motors, answered Roosevelt's call with a decision that stunned the business world. He left his $300,000 salary behind and accepted a single dollar per year to serve the nation that had given him a home. His task was not to build airplanes himself. It was to teach America how to build them in numbers the world had never seen. Knudsen approached the problem as only a master of industry could. He saw factories not merely as buildings but as living organisms, entities that could be reshaped, restructured, and awakened. Detroit, with its rivers of steel and highways of conveyor belts, would become the heart of the transformation. The great automobile titans were summoned. Ford would build bombers. Chrysler would craft aircraft engines. Packard would produce Merlins. Every corporation that once competed for consumers would now compete for victory. The transition was not smooth. Designs evolved faster than factories could adapt. Materials were scarce. Tooling had to be reinvented. Workers who once built sedans now studied blueprints for four-engine bombers. But as 1940 gave way to 1941, the pulse of American production began to quicken. Routines changed. Shifts extended. The quiet hum of industry became a steady roar, and by December 1941, America was producing 2,000 military aircraft per month, a 20-fold increase in only 2 years. Far from the marble halls of Berlin, where predictions of American weakness were treated as gospel, a new reality was taking shape. The United States, a nation often underestimated for its peaceful habits, was learning the rhythms of war. And still, this was only the beginning. The true test of American industry came not in boardrooms or factory floors, but in the skies over distant continents where metal, fire, and human will collided. By late 1942, the Luftwaffe still believed itself the master of the air. Its pilots had carved their reputations in the early Blitzkrieg campaigns, and many assumed that American aviators would fold under pressure. But in the red sands of Tunisia, Major Johannes Steinhoff witnessed a disturbing reversal. Day after day, new American pilots arrived. Their formations grew larger, their discipline tighter. The amateurs of 1942 were becoming professionals, and the veterans of Germany began to understand a brutal truth: they were being outnumbered and outpaced. That realization deepened as the war pushed northward. Over the industrial city of Schweinfurt, German fighter aces stared upward at bomber streams stretching from one horizon to the other. Heinz Bahr, a pilot credited with over 200 victories, described the scene as hopeless. 8 German fighters against hundreds of American bombers and their escorts. Even their skill could not overcome arithmetic. When American raids lost 60 bombers in a single day, factory managers simply replaced them within 2 weeks. No European nation had ever waged war with such depth. By early 1944, the conflict reached its decisive crescendo. The operation known as Big Week unfolded between February 20th and 25, when the 8th and 15th Air Forces launched more than 3,500 bomber sorties against German aircraft production. This was not merely a series of raids, it was a strategic dismemberment of the Luftwaffe. Factories burned. Supply chains fractured. The Luftwaffe lost between 262 and 355 fighters, but the deeper wound lay in the 100 irreplaceable pilots who vanished from its ranks. Germany could build aircraft, though never fast enough. What it could not rebuild was experience. American production lines produced 12,500 fighters a month while losing only 400. German factories produced 1,000 fighters a month while losing 1,200. The math was no longer a contest, it was a verdict. That verdict became visible to the world on June 6, 1944. As Allied ships approached Normandy, 11,590 aircraft guarded the invasion force. Only 319 German sorties rose to challenge them. The sky belonged entirely to the Allies, a vast canopy of Mustangs, Thunderbolts, Lightnings, Fortresses, and Liberators. For the first time in modern warfare, an invasion was executed under nearly complete air supremacy, not because of better tactics, but because one nation had transformed its factories into weapons as powerful as any battleship or tank. In the span of 4 years, the United States had reshaped the air war into a contest defined by endurance and production capacity. The Luftwaffe, once confident in its superiority, now faced an enemy whose strength grew faster than it could be challenged. The battlefield was no longer only above Europe. It extended across assembly lines, drafting tables, and shipping docks thousands of miles away. And in that broader battle space, America could not be stopped. The heart of the American production miracle beat loudest in a place carved out of Michigan farmland. Willow Run was not merely a factory, it was a gamble the size of a small city. Ford engineers envisioned a mile-long assembly line capable of delivering a B-24 Liberator every hour, an ambition so audacious that even seasoned aircraft manufacturers doubted it. When construction began in April 1941, the dream felt larger than the building that tried to contain it. Reality struck quickly. The first bombers that rolled off the line were riddled with flaws. Rivets buckled, wiring snarled, components misaligned. The initial aircraft had to be disassembled and rebuilt almost entirely. Workers joked that Willow Run should be called Will It Run, and critics whispered that the entire project was a costly indulgence. At one point, quality control failures reached nearly 50%. The factory that promised efficiency was drowning in its own ambition. But American industry, like American democracy, proved resilient. Engineers broke the B-24 down into hundreds of sub-assemblies. They reimagined tools, developed hydraulic riveting systems, and introduced prefabricated wiring harnesses that eliminated chaos on the line. The plant absorbed hundreds of design changes in a single year without halting production. Bit by bit, the line stabilized. Workers grew confident. Sections moved with rhythm instead of hesitation. By late 1943, the numbers began shifting. 148 bombers a month, then 365. And finally, in April 1944, Willow Run reached the impossible: 428 B-24s in a single month, one every 63 minutes, 24 hours a day. This lone factory outproduced the entire German aviation industry. The laughter in Berlin had fallen silent. While America perfected efficiency, Germany retreated underground. The Jaeger program attempted to scatter production across hundreds of hidden facilities. The Mittelwerk complex alone relied on 60,000 forced laborers, many of them prisoners who worked under starvation conditions. 20,000 would die there. Sabotage was common. Parts failed inspection. Transportation delays crippled assembly. Factories built to evade Allied bombers became tombs that produced more misery than machines. The contrast could not have been sharper. In the United States, women stepped into aircraft plants with precision and pride. At Douglas, female inspectors reduced defect rates dramatically. At Willow Run, Rosie the Riveter became a national symbol, driving 3,000 rivets per shift with near-perfect accuracy. American tools were redesigned for smaller hands, unintentionally increasing efficiency. Free workers improved quality, enslaved workers undermined it. By the time Germany fielded its advanced Me-2 and 62 jet, the skies were already lost. Technical brilliance could not erase the industrial deficit. Fewer than 200 jets were operational at any time, many grounded by lack of parts or engines that burned out after 10 hours. Meanwhile, America was producing next-generation aircraft, refining designs weekly, and sustaining 2 oceans' worth of war. When the dust settled, the outcome was unmistakable. The turning point of the air war had not been a single battle, but the moment when one nation mastered the art of building faster than its enemy could destroy. Across the world, analysts struggled to understand how a nation once viewed as inward-looking and unprepared had transformed itself into the greatest industrial force in history. From London to Moscow, military observers noted that the American advantage was not simply mechanical. It was cultural. It was political. It was human. Democracies, long dismissed as slow and disorganized, had revealed a capacity for mobilization that dictatorships had never anticipated. Much of that strength came from the American workforce itself. By 1943, 2 million citizens were engaged in aircraft production. Women, who represented less than 1% of the industry in 1941, became 65% of its labor force just 2 years later. Their precision reshaped the very rhythm of manufacturing. At Douglas, female inspectors reduced defect rates from 2% to 0. 3%. At Willow Run, a single riveter like Rose Monroe could outperform entire inspection teams. These workers were not temporary replacements. They were the backbone of a system that grew more capable every month. The social fabric of the workforce was equally transformative. African Americans, Mexican Americans, Native Americans, immigrants, people with disabilities, teenagers, and elderly citizens entered factories together. Many had never shared a workspace before. Yet in these vast assembly halls, they discovered a collective identity built not on race or class, but on contribution. American factories became a quiet refutation of the racist ideology that guided Germany's war effort. Where the Reich relied on coerced labor, the United States relied on voluntary cooperation. And every metric favored the latter. Globally, the results were impossible to overlook. Allied commanders recognized that American production allowed them to replace losses faster than battles could deplete them. German leaders recognized it too, though in far more painful terms. By late 1944, even Goebbels wrote privately that Goering's promises of air superiority were criminal delusions. Hitler, in a rare moment of candor, admitted that Germany had underestimated the industrial depth of the United States. In the end, the world understood a profound truth. War is not only fought on front lines, it is fought in machine shops, research laboratories, union halls, and neighborhoods where ordinary citizens decide what they are willing to build. The American home front had become a weapon, and the world would never again underestimate its power. In the quiet hours after the war ended, long after the smoke had lifted from Europe's cities, Hermann Goering finally confronted the truth he had spent years denying. Arrested by the 36th Infantry Division, confined in interrogation rooms far from the grand halls of Berlin, he was shown the numbers that defined the war he had helped unleash. Film reels displayed endless assembly lines. Charts revealed month after month of production that dwarfed the entire Luftwaffe. One American factory, Willow Run, had built more bombers than his Air Force had ever possessed. He stared at the evidence with a silence more revealing than any confession. For Goering, this realization arrived too late. But for the world, it provided a lens through which to understand the true engine of victory. America did not triumph in the air war because of a single battle or a single aircraft. It triumphed because its people, free to choose their path, chose to work. They chose to adapt. They chose to build. A nation that had seemed hesitant in 1940 became an industrial colossus by 1944, powered not by coercion, but by cooperation. The arsenal of democracy proved that production lines could be as decisive as front lines, and that assembly workers could change the course of history as surely as soldiers. This legacy extends far beyond World War II. The organizational systems born on those factory floors shaped the modern world. The engineers who refined bomber assembly lines later designed rockets that reached the moon. The women who riveted B-24 wings raised children who would redefine American industry, science, and civil rights. The very idea that free societies can outproduce dictatorships remains one of the clearest lessons of the 20th century. And so, we return to that moment in 1940 when a man in Berlin laughed at the idea of America building 50,000 planes a year. He could not imagine that democracy, once stirred, could double that number. He could not imagine that ordinary citizens, united by purpose rather than force, could bury tyranny under a mountain of steel, aluminum, and willpower. The question then is left for us. What does this story teach about the strength of free nations today? And what responsibilities do we inherit from those who proved that production itself can be a form of courage? If you believe these lessons still matter, join the conversation below. Share your thoughts on the next chapter of military history we should explore. The battle may be over, but the history is still being written. The morning air over northern Germany carried a quiet chill, the kind that settles over a landscape before history decides to reveal something unexpected. On November 7, 1943, a lone German test pilot stepped toward a captured P-47 Thunderbolt, its metal skin still cold from the long night. He paused, studying the massive fuselage that seemed almost out of place among the sleek, efficient machines the Luftwaffe considered the pinnacle of wartime engineering. To him, this American fighter looked oversized, inelegant, an unlikely messenger of a new kind of war. Yet, in that moment, standing beneath a fading autumn sun, he sensed that the machine before him carried a secret. Not a tactical trick, not a hidden weapon, but a philosophy. A way of waging the World War II air war that Germany had never fully understood. How could something this heavy, this overbuilt, this unapologetically different, become one of the most decisive tools in the U.S. Army Air Force's arsenal? And what did it reveal about the deeper strength, the American industrial power, that Germany had underestimated for far too long? To answer that, we must return to the moment everything went wrong for a young pilot from Pennsylvania and set in motion a chain of discoveries that changed the war in the air. The mission was supposed to be routine. One more escort sweep in a long season of gray skies, freezing winds, and young men learning too early how fragile a cockpit could feel. On that November morning, the U.S. Army Air Forces launched a formation of B-26 Marauders toward Luftwaffe airfields in occupied France. Their guardians were 12 fighters from the 305th Group, each a P-47 Thunderbolt climbing through layered cloud like iron giants, fighting the weight of winter itself. The weather turned against them almost immediately. Clouds thickened into a blinding wall. Ice crawled across canopies. Instruments trembled under the strain of turbulence. There were no landmarks, no horizon, just an ocean of gray swallowing every sense a pilot depended on. When the bombers abandoned the mission, the Thunderbolts turned home, straight into headwinds no forecast had warned about. Winds over 100 miles per hour pushed the formation backward toward France. Fuel gauges, once reassuring, began their slow, merciless drop. The Thunderbolt was legendary for its durability, but not even its massive tanks could fight the sky itself. Pilots, some barely past their third combat mission, realized they were now racing against empty space inside their own aircraft. Among them was Lieutenant William Edward Roach, flying a spare P-47 he hadn't expected to use. He had joined the formation only because another pilot's engine faltered minutes after takeoff. Now he was alone in the storm, navigating by dead reckoning, hoping the compass would lead him toward the English coast. When he finally broke free of the clouds at 8,000 feet, he expected to see the channel's dark water. Instead, he saw farmland, French farmland. The winds had carried him far off course, and the fuel left in his tanks could barely keep the engine turning for 40 minutes. Below him lay an airfield with grass runways, parked vehicles, and orderly dispersal bays. It looked British. It felt like salvation. Roach descended, lowered his gear, and touched down with the smooth precision of a pilot trained to trust his machine. A jeep rolled toward him. Ground crew waited. Then he saw the rifles, the uniforms, the unmistakable posture of men who did not come to help. What he believed was safety was in fact a Luftwaffe base near Caen. Within hours, Roach was disarmed and on a truck headed deep into Germany. Behind him, the Thunderbolt he had just abandoned, intact, undamaged, and filled with answers the Luftwaffe had been desperate to find, became the most valuable captured aircraft in Europe. And he was not the only pilot lost to the wind that day. One Thunderbolt bellied into a field. Another ditched over icy water and vanished. A third limped home on fumes, crossing the English coast as the engine died beneath him. No enemy fighters had appeared. No flak had been fired. Nature alone had turned the mission into disaster. But for Germany, Roach's misfortune was an extraordinary gift. A perfect P-47 Thunderbolt delivered into their hands. A chance to see inside the American machine, both the aircraft and the industrial system that produced it. When the Luftwaffe towed the captured P-47 Thunderbolt into a hangar at Reckland, their premier test center, German engineers expected to uncover flaws, wasteful design choices, structural inefficiencies, something that explained why this oversized American fighter persisted in the World War II air war despite its apparent crudity. What they discovered instead forced them to confront a truth they had never fully understood. Hans Werner Lerche, one of Germany's most seasoned test pilots, walked around the aircraft with the quiet discipline of a man who had flown over 100 different airframes. Everything about the Thunderbolt challenged his instincts. German fighters like the Bf-109 and Fw-190 were tight, efficient, minimalist. Their fuselages were elegant shells of lightweight alloy, machines shaped by craftsmen who believed perfection came from precision and restraint. The Thunderbolt, by comparison, looked almost agricultural. Thick panels, massive spars, a cockpit roomy enough for a pilot to half stand inside. But aviation truths do not live in appearances. They reveal themselves in the air. Lerche climbed into the cockpit, started the R-2800 engine, and felt the entire aircraft vibrate with a deep, uneven rumble that seemed primitive compared to Germany's smooth, inline engines. Yet, as the radial warmed, the vibrations settled. Temperature stabilized, oil pressure held. The machine behaved as though it simply didn't care about small imperfections, an early hint of the philosophy that built it. The takeoff roll was long and heavy, almost clumsy, but once the Thunderbolt climbed past 20,000 feet, everything changed. The turbocharger came alive. Power surged. Controls tightened. The fighter that had felt like a truck suddenly responded with the precision of a much lighter machine. Lurch rolled, dived, and climbed with growing disbelief. The Thunderbolt could hold energy through maneuvers that should have bled its speed away. In a dive, it accelerated faster than anything he'd flown. In a climb, it refused to surrender momentum. German engineers documented each flight, then dismantled the aircraft piece by piece. What they found shocked them more than its performance at altitude. The Thunderbolt was intentionally overbuilt. Frame members were nearly twice the thickness of German equivalents. Wing spars resembled those of a medium bomber. Fuselage skins were so thick that German calculations labeled them wastefully excessive. But in the margins of those reports were notes that revealed a dawning realization. The Americans hadn't designed the Thunderbolt to be perfect. They had designed it to survive, to absorb battle damage, to tolerate imperfect manufacturing, to be built by thousands of workers with varied skill levels, then repaired in muddy fields by crews with only basic tools. Every thick rib, every heavy spar, every redundant system, each was a clue pointing toward American industrial power, a system designed to produce fighters, not one at a time, but in waves. Lurche understood at first the Thunderbolt was not a masterpiece of engineering. It was a masterpiece of strategy, and its strength in the air was only one part of the larger storm Germany was about to face. By early 1944, the truth that German engineers uncovered inside the captured P-47 Thunderbolt began to reveal itself across the skies of Europe. What the Luftwaffe faced was no longer a contest of pilot skill or aircraft agility. It had become a confrontation with a national engine of production and training that Germany could neither outrun nor outlast. The numbers told the story with cruel clarity. While German factories struggled to deliver fighters, hampered by shortages of aluminum, fuel, and experienced labor, American assembly lines filled the docks of England with wave after wave of new machines. Hundreds of Thunderbolts each month. Thousands of replacement pilots from the U.S. Army Air Forces, many with triple the flight hours of their German counterparts. Where Germany produced excellence in small batches, America produced competence at continental scale. The human cost inside the Luftwaffe began rising faster than commanders could absorb. Veteran pilots, men who had survived the earliest, hardest years of the World War II air war, were now being lost to coordinated Allied tactics and relentless American firepower. New pilots arrived at frontline units with barely 100 hours of flight time. Some were sent into combat with only 10 hours in their assigned aircraft. Many never survived their first mission. And above them, the Thunderbolt's transformation from heavy fighter to high-altitude predator was becoming brutally clear. American squadrons adapted their tactics, climbing to 30,000 feet before crossing into German airspace. There, the P-47's turbocharged engine turned cold, thin air into an ally. German fighters climbing from below could not match the speed of Thunderbolts diving from the sun. The moment the Americans fired 8 50 caliber machine guns created a moving storm of metal that tore through wings, fuel tanks, cowlings, anything caught inside its path. German pilots described flying into those attacks as entering a wall. Even glancing hits degraded performance. A damaged Thunderbolt, however, often remained fully controllable. Pilots brought home aircraft riddled with holes, controls stiff, engines coughing, but still flying. The Luftwaffe, by contrast, flew machines so finely engineered that a single coolant leak or structural fracture could mean instant death. Bit by bit, Germany's aerial strength eroded. It was not a dramatic collapse, but a steady draining away. One squadron losing 3 aircraft here, another losing 5 pilots there. Every week, fewer veterans returned to base. Every month, new replacements lasted less time in combat. Luftwaffe leadership issued revised tactics, urging pilots to avoid high-altitude fights, to attack only with an advantage, to disengage whenever possible. But war does not pause for recovery. American formations flew deeper into Germany with heavier escorts and greater experience. The Thunderbolt's presence grew not only as a fighter, but as a punishing ground attack machine that shredded rail lines, convoys, and armored columns. Every loss of infrastructure pushed Germany further into the dark. By late spring, one truth had become undeniable within Luftwaffe headquarters. Germany was no longer losing a battle in the air. It was losing the war of replacement. A war America had been preparing to fight long before the first Thunderbolt ever reached the front. From the American side, the unfolding reality of the World War II air war was not merely a testament to a single fighter's capability, but to a broader doctrine, one rooted in the nation's industrial confidence. The P-47 Thunderbolt, durable and forgiving, reflected the deeper philosophy of the U.S. Army Air Forces: build machines that average pilots could fly, maintain, repair, and return to combat with minimal delay. It was aviation shaped, not in laboratories, but on factory floors, where production speed mattered as much as elegance. This industrial logic became a lens through which the world viewed American strategy. Allies recognized that the United States was demonstrating something unprecedented, a wartime system powerful enough to replace losses faster than an enemy could inflict them. Britain saw in America not just a partner, but a nation capable of sustaining a long war. The Soviet Union, fighting its own brutal struggle, took note of the overwhelming flow of aircraft and supplies crossing oceans. Neutral nations understood that America's strength lay not simply in technology, but in the reliability of its logistics. Meanwhile, the Luftwaffe, once Europe's dominant air arm, felt the consequences most sharply. They knew how to build extraordinary fighters. They did not know how to build thousands of them without sacrificing performance. They trained superb pilots but could not train them in industrial quantities. With each month, as Thunderbolts and Mustang escorts tightened control over German skies, the Luftwaffe's strategic options narrowed. Even successful missions cost Germany irreplaceable men and machines. The American approach extended beyond the battlefield. After the war, the United States absorbed key German engineers through Operation Paperclip, including those who once evaluated the captured Thunderbolt. The message was unmistakable. America not only outproduced its enemies, but also learned from them, deepening its technological lead for the era ahead. The world recognized this blend of industrial might and intellectual pragmatism as a defining feature of American power. In the end, nations watching the air war understood that the Thunderbolt's legacy was larger than its combat record. It symbolized a truth shaping the modern age. Wars would be determined not only by bravery or innovation, but by systems, vast, coordinated, resilient. And in that realm, the United States had proven itself unmistakably built different. By the final year of the World War II air war, the lesson that began with a single lost fighter near Cannes had become unmistakable. The P-47 Thunderbolt was never meant to be perfect. It was meant to endure through weather, through battle, through the long grind of a conflict fought across continents. And in its thick skin, redundant systems, and thundering radial engine, America revealed something far more powerful than aerodynamic elegance. It revealed the strength of a nation willing to build not just fighters, but the industrial machine behind them. For the U.S. Army Air Forces, the Thunderbolt became a symbol of what American warfighting would increasingly depend on: resilience, scale, and the ability to bring thousands of ordinary airmen home alive. Pilots remembered its cockpit not for beauty but for space. They remembered the way it stayed in the air even after absorbing punishment no other fighter could survive. They remembered that when the sky turned against them, the aircraft under them did not. To the Luftwaffe, the Thunderbolt's presence became something heavier than metal. It was a reminder that Germany was no longer fighting a series of aerial duels. It was fighting a system. Factories, rail lines, oil fields, training schools, and a workforce spread across an ocean. They could shoot down Thunderbolts, and they did, often with skill and courage. But the truth was unavoidable. America's strength was not measured in single victories, but in the tens of thousands of hands that built, rebuilt, and flew these fighters every day. The legacy of the P-47 is not simply its impressive kill ratios or the miles of wrecked rail lines it left across Europe. Its legacy is the idea that victory in modern war belongs to the side that can sustain the fight, to the side whose machines can fail gracefully, whose pilots can learn from mistakes instead of dying from them, whose industry can absorb losses without collapsing. That was the heart of American industrial power, and it reshaped the air war forever. As we look back on that era, one question lingers for us today. In a world that still depends on readiness, logistics, and the capacity to endure, do we still understand the value of what the Thunderbolt represented? Thank you for joining this journey into a chapter of aviation history that still echoes across our world. If stories like this speak to you, stories of courage, engineering, and the systems that shape destiny, consider joining us for the next one. There is always more to uncover, more to remember, and more to learn from the past. In the dim light beneath the wing of a worn bomber, a man in grease-stained coveralls tightened the last bolts on a weapon no handbook had ever approved.